If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
For those who camp, hike, or spend a lot of time in remote areas, deep woods, or forests, what is the scariest or strangest thing/creature you've ever encountered out there?
A few months ago, in the Pennsylvania mountains, my best friend and I decided to take a day trip together. We got somewhat of a late start to the day and arrived about an hour before the sun went down. We decided to go on a back road that I know about from previous trips to this area. As we drive down and enjoy the scenery, I get out of the car after we park and start walking while my friend stays by the small river. I start to get this sense of dread, and he tells me to come back over to him. He says we should get in the car before it gets darker where we were. Mind you, we were in the deep part of a forest, which gets darker quicker. We get my car, and he starts driving, and a few minutes into our drive out, he slammed on the brakes and said with panic, "Did you see that?" And I was looking at my map, but I got a small glimpse of it. There was a figure, long legs about 7 feet tall, a complete shadow person that took 2 steps across the road we were on and then 1 step onto the mountain and vanished. I knew he wasn't crazy because I saw it too. Right after this happened, my GPS shut off. Now I know what you're probably thinking, you're in the forest, of course you won't have service. Agreed, but this road is a more known area with homes in the forest, meaning there is a place for reception. I had reception the entire time until we both saw this shadow figure. We are still shaken to this day because we still cannot figure out what that was, crossing the huge road in only 2 steps. And then losing all cell service when we had it all the rest of the time? I'd love to hear your thoughts, as we considered it a shadow figure, Wendigo, or Skinwalker, but we still can't figure out what really happened to us that night. Safe to say we haven't gone back. One year, I was camping with my church youth group on one of the leader's properties, which was situated right on the edge of a forest. Anyways, a group of us decided to mess with one of the older kids, he was 17 then, by jump scaring him with one of those serial killer hockey masks. It was very juvenile, I know. So one of us goes to see if he's in his tent. They walk up and yell, "Hey, are you in there?" And we hear a responsive "Go away" in his voice. So the kid with the mask went up to his tent and tried to shake it, then popped out wearing the mask, but that's when we realized he wasn't there. We're confused, so we head back to the main group up at the fire, where we find the kid who said he'd been there for the past 2 hours. Mind you, there was no way for him to have gotten from his tent and to the fire before us. The scariest part was that I heard footsteps walking around my tent all night. I also heard the howls of a pack of coyotes in the forest. I still joke that we were visited by skinwalkers. So this happened to me. This was a little while ago, and I was getting off my part-time job at Wendy's. My boss was giving me a tough time all day, and I was worn out of it, so I went home, grabbed my keys, and got in my car. I started driving to my little cabin in the woods, about 3 to 4 miles away from my house. It had a lake next to it and was surrounded by trees and wildlife, with one little road leading up to it. I started unpacking all my stuff and after flopped on my bed and closed my eyes. I think I was asleep for about 3 hours. I suddenly woke up to my car alarm going off. Luckily I had remote keys and shut the car off from the cabin. Then about 30 minutes later it happened again, so I shut the car off and went back to sleep. After it happened again, I waited by the window to see what was happening. My heart sank when I saw this thing crawl out of the woods and punch the car, then run back in and hide behind a tree. That's when I realized it was trying to wear me out. After that, I grabbed all of my important stuff and ran downstairs. That's when I heard the door get kicked in, so I went in the closet, which had an attic door, so I went up and hid. The thing came into my room and busted the door. There was a little hole in the door that I could look though, and I saw its face that's still in my mind. It had stapled shut eyes and a nailed back mouth. It crawled out and went back into the woods. That's when I ran to my car and drove away. I haven't gone back to that cabin and never will, not even for my stuff. I go to a summer camp, it's a co-ed camp, and I think it was my first year. A group of us campers and a few counselors took a hike to a cemetery, and when we got there, me and a friend of mine were looking at a tombstone, and I looked behind us at the field, and I saw what looked like people standing on the gravel just in front of the tree line. I get up and look away for a few seconds and say, "Hey, do you see that?" To get my friend's attention, and when she looks, I have looked at her, and when she says, "What are you talking about?" I look back and what I had seen is gone, and I shrug it off and go back to my group as he heads the 1 mile back to camp through the woods, and on the way back I would see shadows ducking back behind trees again. I shrug it off, and we got back to our cabins, and we go and eat dinner and ultimately go to our evening program. We are playing woods games. And one of the main rules is no going down to the waterfront, and while in the middle of a game I hear my friend say, "Hey, come here and look at this." So I walk over and look at what she's looking at, and it's what looks to be a man standing on the farthest floating dock, and he's looking at us, and this being a private property, no one should be out on that dock, so wrong. Both run back to the picnic tables, and we tell our compiler, and at first she doesn't believe us, saying it's just our imagination and going back to playing, so we do, and that night after everyone was asleep, I get up and I'm sitting on my bunk, and I hear what sounds like a guy laughing and tapping on the window, so I look and don't see anything, and I shrug, thinking it was one of the guys' cabins pranking us, and I fall back asleep, and at about 5 a.m., it was just starting to become light, and I wake up to tapping and I look across the room at the window and see someone, and I let out this startled squeak and hide under my covers, and I remember starting to cry, being scared, and eventually I fell back asleep. When I get woken up, I hear my friend say, "Hey, are you okay? You look like you were crying," and I shook my head, and everyone went to go get ready for breakfast. I looked down the trail to see 4 figures sitting at the end of the trail and crawling into the woods, and to this day that day still scares me, and I've never experienced anything down the trail to see 4 figures sitting at the end of the trail and crawling into the woods, and to this day that day still scares me, and I've never experienced anything like that again. My brother just had a Yowie, Australian Bigfoot, encounter, and his friend and him are rattled. They are both avid big hunters and have never believed in the paranormal or have been scared. Pigs are an apex pest in Australia. They both had goosebumps as they arrived but decided to continue. A few hundred meters into their hike, they heard huge tree knocks but acknowledged it was weird and continued. Within 50 more meters, they heard a little girl start to giggle, and my brother decided not to bring it up until a few seconds later a second giggle joined in. They agreed on what they heard and were terrified. They just arrived home about 20 minutes ago. I've never seen either of them rattle. They were in an extremely isolated area with no chance of children being this deep into the bush. I thought I would share what he told me while it was fresh. Just to add, they have well-trained hunting dogs, and one turned into a crying mess when returning to them. The others ran each way the giggles were coming until they were called back. I forgot to mention the girlfriend of my brother's friend was there and saw strangely bent trees and branches that looked unnatural, and with purpose, she noticed before the tree knock. "I'm going to try my best to see if I can get him to take me tomorrow night." He said, "You don't want to duck around with what we did tonight." A few years ago, I moved to a small, quiet town surrounded by dense woods. I had always enjoyed nature, so the idea of living near the forest was appealing. I spent most weekends exploring the trails, taking in the fresh air, and enjoying the solitude. But one weekend, I experienced something that still sends chills down my spine. It was late autumn, and the days were getting shorter. I decided to go walking on a trail I hadn't explored yet. The path was narrow, winding deeper into the woods than I expected. The further I went, the quieter it became. There were no birds singing, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that felt unnatural. After about an hour of walking, I came across a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were broken, and the wooden walls were covered in moss. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curious, I approached the cabin. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a dusty interior filled with old, rotting furniture. As I stepped inside, I noticed a strange smell, something earthy and metallic. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach churn. Despite the smell, I continued to explore. The cabin was small, just one room with a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed covered in tattered blankets. On the table, there was an old journal. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it to the first page and saw that it was a diary. The entries were written in a messy scrawl, recounting the life of someone who had lived in the cabin. The entries were mundane at first, talking about the weather, hunting, and daily chores. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone of the writing changed. The author started mentioning a friend who visited them in the woods. The entries became increasingly paranoid, with the author writing about hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night and seeing shadows moving between the trees. The last few entries were nearly illegible, written in a frantic hand. The final entry read: "The friend in the woods. He's not human. He's coming for me. If anyone finds this, stay away from the woods. He's watching." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I quickly closed the journal and left the cabin, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. As I stepped back outside, the silence of the woods felt oppressive. I hurried back to the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves and every snap of a twig made me jump. I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Then I heard it, footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, matching my pace. I stopped and turned around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped as well. I stood there, holding my breath, listening. After a few moments of silence, I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps resumed, this time closer. Panic set in, and I broke into a run. I could hear the footsteps behind me, now running as well. I didn't dare look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning and my heart racing. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and it felt like I would never make it out of the woods. Finally, I saw the trailhead in the distance. I sprinted towards it, the footsteps still behind me. As I burst out of the woods and onto the main road, the footsteps stopped. I turned around, gasping for breath, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent woods. I never went back to that trail. In fact, I stopped hiking altogether. Whatever was in those woods, whatever that friend was, I didn't want to encounter it again. Even now, when I think back to that day, I can still hear those footsteps in the back of my mind, and I can't help but wonder if something followed me out of those woods. And if it's still watching. It was a dark afternoon about 10 years ago when I was 13 years old, but I still remember this story like it was yesterday. Me and my dad love renting trailers and camping in the forest. It was a cold Arizona day, so we brought multiple blankets. We started a fire and made s'mores and marshmallows. After that, we went to sleep. I always loved to sleep next to the window because I love the cold breeze. I woke up at 4 a.m., and what I saw will never get out of my head. It was a huge person, 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet. His leg was skinny as a deer, and his torso was a bit fat. He was standing on 2 legs, staring at me. His face was dark and bearskin on his head. I woke up my dad, and I've never seen someone who barely woke up to the brink of shitting himself. He told me to shut the duck up and be quiet. He told me it was a Wendigo or a Skinwalker. The creature ran around our trailer so fast my eyes could not keep up with it. Then the creepiest experience that had ever happened to me happened. The creature slammed himself in the window, almost breaking it. He was screaming at me, roaring. I could not fall asleep until he got bored and left. Let's just say I didn't camp anymore. So I was 11 at the time, and in 2019 I was at grade 6 camp. It was our second night, which was our last night. We played commando, and I was a capture, so I had to hide with my group and a teacher. About 20 minutes in, we heard rustling in the bushes. We shone the light, and there was nothing, so we continued playing. There was a distant shadow, and we waited, and it soon left. We then started speaking about it, saying there shouldn't be anyone on its private property. The next day, everyone spotted a transparent figure walking with a shovel behind him. What was creepy was there was a graveyard next to our camp areas with a fence separating them. I'm not sure where to share this, but after all these years, this whole event still feels paranormal. I don't know what to make of it, so sharing for any perspective or feedback. When I was 9 months old, my dad drowned in a freak accident. He was helping friends lose a canoe that had gotten stuck in the river. The undertow snagged him, and no one saw him alive again. I found him a few days later, a couple miles down the river. 20 years later, I am camping with my girlfriend, at the time, now ex, and my best brother and his GF. It's a beautiful summer night in Pacific NW, and it was about 9:30 p.m. so mostly dark. My brother and I hiked a short trip to this rock overhang that had a perfect view of the river. Lit up some cigarettes, sipped on a beer, chatted, and took in the view. 2 minutes in, and this happens. Across the riverbank, I see my dad standing there, staring at me. I don't remember knowing him, but I do have an image in mind from pictures. He looked exactly like my dad at the time he died. I hit my friend and ask him if he's seeing this scene, but he doesn't. Then a sort of spotlight blasts my dad, and he immediately breaks the stare and walks to his left, about 20 feet down the river, and a little back into the trees. He slowly starts pulling some tools and a rope out of a cache or bag. At this point I am pale and shaking. My friend is worried because I'm staring into the dark and not responding. But wow, what I was seeing. The whole other side of Riverbank was now a stage, lit up, and my dad was working on something with his back to me. He finally turns around and has a noose in his hands. He throws it over a tree branch and proceeds to slip it around his neck and, saying nothing, ends himself to death while staring at me. We had odd experiences for the rest of the night, but nothing like that. I'm now 41 and still haven't integrated this experience. It really messed me up, and I can't help but wonder, did he really drown, or is that what I was told? I had numerous close calls with death as a young adult, but never by hanging. Was my dad telling me a hidden truth? Was that someone or something else? It's been a strange one. Years ago, when I was about 13-14 years old, we went camping somewhere up in northern Michigan. Well, one of the days we were up there, my dad and I decided to walk to the lake early morning so we could fish for bass. We wanted to be there by 6 a.m., so we started walking around 5:15 a.m. with our fishing equipment, poles, boxes, net, cooler, water, snacks, etc. The lake was maybe about 2 to 3 miles out or so. Anyways, about 30 minutes into the walk, the both of us had to pee. At this time, it's very dusk, but I could see much better now since it wasn't pitch dark like it was 30 minutes ago and my eyes got used to the darkness. The both of us face opposite directions, and as I'm peeing, I freak out because in the distance I see an old white lady looking at us. Just standing there upright like a human wearing what looked like a white nightgown. I'm confused because why would an old white lady in nightwear be out in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, in the woods, staring at us at 5:30 a.m.? There was no question in mind, it's an old white lady, though. I tell my dad, "Dad, there's an old lady watching us pee." He's like, "Eh?" I reiterate it again, and then he's like, "Where?" And as I turned around to point at it, he couldn't see it but what I previously saw as the white old lady. Now I see some kind of animal staring back, but now on all fours. And then it slowly moves its glance away from us and walks away, disappearing into the dark mist. Both of us are confused. Creepy. Maybe it was an animal I really saw that my brain tricked me into thinking it was an old white lady, or maybe it was something else. But yeah, that's my story. When I was about 10, my dad and I went exploring in the woods close to our house. Once we got to the edge of our property, I started to turn around, and Dad said, "Let's walk up the fence line a little ways." On our way up, nothing was out of the ordinary because I had explored our 10 acres every day, and I knew that there were some trees down over the fence, but I was told not to leave the property. When we got to the big oak trees that smashed the fence decades before we moved there, Dad jumped on the tree and started to cross the property line onto our neighbors' and good friends' land. I was excited because I have only been there a few times. After 45 minutes of walking and pushing our way through the thick underbrush, we came to another fence that we crossed so we didn't have to go back the way we came. At this point, I was turned around and didn't really know where I was. But I was with my dad, and he has been navigating woods, mountains, and deserts all his life, so I was good. Once we crossed the fence, the woods opened up, and it was easier to walk. I started asking questions like, "Where are we? What was that noise? Did you hear that?" Dad would chuckle and maybe change the direction. Thinking back now, I know he heard it and was a little on edge but keeping calm. 10 minutes of these questions, I'm a little shaken and worried, but all that went away when I saw the abandoned house. I pointed it out to my dad, and we made our way over to it. On the way, Dad was telling me that we need to be careful and watch for rusted nails and weak floorboards. Once we made it to the porch, we walked in the house with Dad leading. I was just tracing his steps. We walked in the living room, the kitchen, and the 2 bedrooms downstairs, and when we went to go upstairs, Dad broke through the bottom stair. I asked if I could go up there and look around, and he told me to be careful and said he'd be on the porch. When I went upstairs, it was just an empty room. Fast forward 6 years later, I was hunting one day in November, mostly stalking. I noticed the weather changing kind of quick, and I started heading back home. It started to downpour, and I took off running, trying to beat the rain and not get soaked. As I'm running, I remember that I was in the area of the abandoned house and started running in that direction. When I saw the house, the rain came down even harder. I jumped on the porch and got out of the rain. I walked inside the house and took off my vest, leaned my rifle on the wall, and stared to walk around. Never being back to the house till then. I remembered what my dad told me about being careful. I didn't follow the same path from 6 years ago, but I didn't go upstairs. The rain had lightened up a little, not much, so I walked back into the kitchen to kill more time, and I noticed the temperature drop a little bit and the wind picked up outside. As I was walking out of the kitchen, the rain had stopped, so I went to gather my things, and just as I reached for my rifle, I heard what sounded like breaking glass, so I looked down, and there was a small board under my foot. I started to pick up the board, and the temperature dropped again, and the wind picked up in the house. I looked back at the kitchen, where the only window was that the wind could come in, and all I saw was leaves and small twigs blowing at me, and then it felt like someone pushed me and held me against the wall. I couldn't move from the wall, no matter how hard I tried to move. When the wind stopped, I was able to move again. I grabbed my rifle and sprinted the half-mile back to the house. This was not my experience but rather my cousin's. My cousin does not drink or do drugs, and until this experience, he was not interested in this stuff, nor did he believe it. In the late winter of 2017, He received a semi-serious telescope from his wife and kids as a birthday gift. He lives by himself on a 1,200-acre horse farm in the eastern US near the coast. There are about 4 to 5 more people who live on the property, but the houses they are in are more than 100 yards away from his place. It gets very dark at night, the only lighting is from flood lights on the property when there is no moon. He was waiting for a moonless night to use the telescope. He set up pretty late, all by himself, in a folding camp chair with his telescope. After about an hour of looking at the night sky, he thought he had heard a small child talking. He became unnerved as it was coming from the direction of the nearby woods, and it was very dark and he could not see anything. His only source of illumination was his phone. This went on for a short time as he tried to make sense of it. His 2 daughters only visited on weekends, there were not other kids on the farm that day. He started to get actually scared and packed up the telescope and headed towards his place at a brisk walk. He called me the next day to tell me what happened. I asked him what the voice was saying, and he said he didn't know but could hear it very clearly and estimated it to be only 20 feet or so away. He said he couldn't understand what was being said. When I pressed him, he said something like, "You know when somebody mocks a language they can't speak." Within a year of this, his youngest daughter discovered 3 to 4 tracks in the nearby woods as they were out on a hike. He has a completely different perspective on this phenomenon now. We are now estranged, and we no longer speak, so I can't provide any updates. When I was 13, me and 3 friends had a sleepover at my friend's house. I'm going to call her Sam. At around 2 a.m., we were starting to get worn out but didn't want to sleep yet. So we went for a walk with Sam's dog, just down the street and back to get some energy. On one side of the street, there is a forest. If you walk up the street from the bottom, the forest is on the left side right next to the road, and after about halfway to Sam's house, there are houses on the left side with the forest behind them. When we had walked to the bottom, we started to walk back up again. After we had walked about 50 meters up the street, the dog wanted to go to the left side of the road, to the woods, to sniff something, so Sam walked over, and me and my other 2 friends stayed on the right side. After a few seconds, the dog looks into the forest, stiffens up tight, and you can tell she was looking at something. Me and Sam were looking into the forest to try and figure out what the dog was looking at. I wasn't really surprised since I just assumed it was a deer or something. There are a ton of deer in the area. But about 5 seconds later, I hear Sam yelling at the top of her lungs, "Run!" Right when she yells, I see a very tall and big looking black silhouette standing up and running along the tree line. We start running as fast as we can to Sam's house. When we had run maybe 15 to 20 meters, I looked into the forest and saw this thing still running in the tree line beside us. And then it all of a sudden starts running twice as fast and turns into the forest and disappears. When we finally get to Sam's house, everyone is really shaken up and trying to make sense of what just happened. I took a glass of water to drink, and even though the glass was only half full, I was shaking so much that water was spilling out of the glass. I was terrified. We started comparing what we saw. It turns out the only ones who saw anything were me and Sam, the other didn't see anything, they just heard Sam yelling and started to run. Both of us saw the exact same thing. A tall, dark silhouette that was at first crouching down and then stood up and ran. It had the shape of a human but with really long arms. And one thing we also found strange was how smooth it was running. This was in the middle of winter with probably around 1 meter of snow, not to mention it was pitch black, with a lot of trees, bushes, and also quite a few large rocks under the snow. Running that fast and that smooth would be impossible. Next morning, the 2 friends who had stood with me during the event last night went back and found some enormous footprints in the snow. A few months later in the summer, me and Sam were both agreeing that it could have been a Sasquatch or something similar. One night the 2 of us had a sleepover and decided to go out at night and look for it again. We went out at around midnight. In Sweden the sun never sets during the summer, so we had light during the entire night. We didn't find anything and headed back to the house. Once we were pretty close to the house when we heard something being thrown. We looked in that direction, and this time we saw a rock fly through the air and land in a bush. Something was throwing rocks at us. We hurried home and didn't go out and look for it again. I don't think we actually even talked about it all until last year. At that point it had been 7 years. We both started shaking just talking about it again. It's 8 years ago now, and I still won't go into the forest after dark. It's the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. This happened when I was 17 or 18 and a senior in high school. I had some stoner friends that were also big Innowoods people. They went camping year round, and one winter they convinced me to come with them. I pack up all my warmest stuff, and early one morning I leave with them to the mountains. We hiked for several hours, getting ourselves good and lost. Not gonna lie, I was kind of enjoying the feeling. Like I was a pioneer or something. After a long time hiking, We come across a clearing and decide that's as good a place as any to make camp. We set up the tent, a big thermal one, and gather as much firewood as we can. Find as many dry/dryish pieces as possible. One of the guys uses some lighter fluid to get them going, and we all mow down on some MREs. After we eat, one of the guys starts passing around the herb. I don't smoke, so I just kind of dry my feet as my friends start sharing their high thoughts. Some real stuff. The sun eventually goes down, and we all retreat to the tent. I woke up in the middle of the night with a severe need to pee, so I stepped outside and began pissing into the bush. I'm trying my best to spell my name in the winter darkness when I hear my friend scream, "Bro, check this out," from the bush. I shout back, "What are you doing?" and begin moving closer into the foliage when I hear that same friend shout, "Shut the duck up and go back to sleep," from the tent. For the first time, I feel a bitter cold as I realize what was up. By now my eyes were adjusted, and the moonlight was bouncing off the snow. I became acutely aware of two lights shining at me from almost feet level on the ground. From there I was able to make out more and more of a face, just staring at me stone still. It was a kid's face, dirty and pale gray. As soon as I realized this, I jump back in fear, and the face gives a look like damn almost and quickly disappears into the bush. I book it back to the tent and don't sleep. Luckily we had to get back to town the next day because of school the day after. I move faster than everyone and never go camping again. I'm in my 20s now and live in the same area. I haven't been to those woods since. When my mother, Courtney, was a child, she and her cousin Kara were in Rush Run Park, a very wooded state park. They were simply walking a trail when, from deep in the woods, they heard some mysterious classical music, like from a record player. She thought that it was her cousin's brother, Ryan. Kara must have thought the same. They both looked at each other, and Courtney asked where it was coming from. Now my mother doesn't remember how the conversation went, they both just went into the woods, thinking that it was their relative Ryan. So, they just walked and walked further into the forest for about 10 minutes. The music had been getting farther and farther away but still staying at the same volume, indicating that it was moving at a similar rate as they were walking. At some point, they both looked at each other at the exact same time. And then they realized, again at the exact same time, that whatever this music was coming from, it wasn't Kara's brother. They quickly started running in the opposite direction, away from this music. They got out of the woods and ran into their grandmother's apartment, which backed up right onto the park. When they ran in, Ryan was already inside the apartment, confirming their suspicions that whatever was making that music wasn't him. He wouldn't have been able to loop around them that fast from where the music was coming from. They just stayed inside for the rest of the day. After that, they never went back to that state park. Last year I went on a solo hike with my tent in Müritz National Park in Germany. I hadn't really planned the route precisely, I just wanted to walk north. After walking through the forest for several hours, it was slowly getting darker, so I wanted to check Google Maps to see where the nearest place to camp was. Camping is prohibited directly in the national park forest. However, I had no reception there, which I hadn't considered beforehand. So, I walked on for a while and eventually came to a small settlement in the middle of the national park. There were maybe 5 houses and a small chapel right next to a small cemetery. Since the sun was slowly setting and I needed a place to camp, I decided to ask someone who lived there. An old man was sitting in one of the gardens in front of one of the houses. I explained my situation to him, and he offered me to sleep on the meadow next to the cemetery. Since I had no other option, I graciously accepted the offer. So, I set up my tent there, made myself comfortable, and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up because I heard a child's voice. I sat up abruptly and initially thought I had only dreamed it. I listened to the silence of the night for a few seconds. Just as I was about to lie back down, I suddenly heard a clear child's voice whispering, "Hello, who are you?" My eyes were wide open. After a few seconds, I responded out of pure fear, "I'll be gone tomorrow, I promise." Shortly after, I heard footsteps running through the grass, moving away from my tent. I couldn't make sense of the situation at all. I was in shock and exhausted at the same time. I sat upright in my tent for probably an hour or so and thought about what had just happened, but I couldn't come to any meaningful conclusion. Eventually, I was so exhausted that I fell back asleep. The next morning, as I was dismantling my tent, I saw the man in his garden again. I went to ask him if there were any children living in the settlement. He looked at me in surprise, and after thinking for a moment, he told me that the last child had lived here over 50 years ago but had drowned in a nearby lake back then and was buried in the cemetery right next to where I had camped that night. To this day, I don't know what to make of this story. But for me, it was definitely the creepiest experience I've ever had in my life, and I surely won't forget it soon. I was camping once, and for days, there was some kind of orange orbs thing intermittently coming up from the ground, arcing a bit in a path to about 2 stories up, hovering there for a few minutes, and then disappearing. I was able to drive right under one of them and was able to hear or smell nothing even with the engine off and standing outside the vehicle. The light would fade out and leave no trace. The light was the only trace of them. The arcs they would travel would vary slightly. They came up one at a time, but without an exact amount of time between them. There was only ever one at a time, though. I also found them in several places, with a few miles in between. I was never able to see them close up when they launched. I saw one and then drove 2 miles to my campsite, only to find another one had come up near my campsite. I was the only one on the road, and on the only good road. There is no way another human could have passed me to get to the new location and launch that second one. I also never saw any sign or noise of anyone near the launch. There were some campers near one of the common launch areas, but no one was outside the campers, and all seemed asleep. In another area I saw them, I could see no campers. I only saw them at night. I saw them all 3 nights I was there. Others also saw them but did not seem curious for some reason. The light seemed about the size of a fist. That was a few years ago. I visit that area once or twice a year and have never seen them on any other visits. May 2020 was the 13-year anniversary of my dad passing away from prostate cancer. I like to celebrate his life every year by going camping, as that was one of his favorite hobbies. This year was different because it was the start of the pandemic, so all the campgrounds, cabins, and getaways were closed. I didn't let this deter me though and decided I'd either car camp or camp someplace remote. I wanted to go someplace I'd never been, so I turned off my navigation system and just followed the roads. About 11 p.m. that night, I was exhausted enough to pull off and go to sleep. I went down a paved road to a group of cabins. No signage anywhere, so I don't know what this campground/cabin rental was called. I pulled in farther up the road, away from the cabins, and prepared to get comfortable for the night. I pulled out a book, took my contacts out, and put my glasses on. I don't know how long I'd been reading for before I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up and was almost immediately startled. Off in the woods were several dozen pinpricks of light moving through the trees. I turned off the overhead light and sat up. These lights looked just like fireflies, except they were the wrong color. Instead of a yellow-green light, they were a whitish blue. They moved just like fireflies, blinking in and out and moving through the trees close to the ground. We also don't have fireflies that luminescence here on the west coast of the USA. I stared for a few minutes pondering what I was looking at before getting creeped out and deciding to go to bed right then and there. Looking it up later, I found that people call these lights will-o'-the-wisps. To this day, I don't know what I saw. The world's first PNW fireflies? Flashlights? Perhaps it's just as simple as my dad saying hi. Yesterday night around 12:45 to 1 a.m. myself and 2 buddies went up to Del Valle to eat our jack-in-the-box and look at the stars. We initially turned left onto a side road to look at the view because I had never parked there. There were 3 cars and teenagers, so we decided to go a little further down onto the empty main road. As I was turning out, the kids started to start their cars and leave. We turned left off the side road onto the main road and pulled over to the right to enjoy the peacefulness. We went out to go eat on the hood of the car, despite it being pretty chill out. We started eating our food and chatting about life. We were finishing up when I heard what I thought was a weird humming/throat noise. I wasn't immediately startled because I thought my buddy was messing around just trying to scare us. But I was confused at the same time because he was mid-sentence when the noise happened. I said, "What was that? Was that you?" He said, "Nah, that literally wasn't me," in a scared laugh. I certainly wasn't off poo yet, and we were kind of speculating and laughing about it, making jokes about wrong turn mutants, which we always like to do when we are outdoors. My friend said, "Yeah, we don't duck with that on DD." Immediately after, he said that it happened again, and we heard it much more clearly because no one was talking this time. It sounded like a humanish agony groan that was no longer than 3 seconds. It was definitely not my buddy. From our POV, we are standing by the front of the car, facing the passenger rear side, where the road starts going down into a grassy hillside. The noise was almost certainly coming from the grass and pretty close, enough to make me feel like I was in imminent danger. Fight or flight kicked in, and we scrambled into the car, rolling all of the windows up while my buddy collected the $30 bucks of Jack in the Box from the hood, locked the doors, turned the car on, and put it into gear. We were driving down the road the opposite way. We needed to get some and would have to U-turn soon. Not within 5 seconds of driving off, a police truck with his orange lights on passed us, heading in the direction of the noise and where we had just been parked. He pulled over not 30 yards away from where we were parked. He didn't pull out after us, so I ruled out him being suspicious of us. It's like he heard the same thing we did. As we drove by the spot where the kids were parked, we checked to see if they were still there, maybe messing with us. No cars. Maybe it was a homeless or mentally ill person roaming around the hills. In that split second of hearing the sound for the second time, my gut tells me it was some freaky creature watching us through the grass on all fours. Again, the noise sounded human, but just not fully. Maybe ghoulish? Supernatural? I am religious. With good there must be evil. I certainly do not doubt that dark magic exists. Kind of bummed because it's a cool place to get away and enjoy the stars, but now I don't know if I want to go back. Maybe with a firearm and more people? I attended college in Northwest Georgia. The school had a campus of 27,000 acres for approximately 2,000 students, so as you can imagine, it was mostly fields and woodlands. My senior year, the school was short on housing for women and asked for female volunteers to move into apartments on a remote part of campus. They had been built back in the 1930s to house workers for the school dairy and were a couple of miles from the main part of campus. The apartment complex was small, maybe 8 units? It sat on a hill with lovely views and had access to hiking trails. Plus, when you went to a school that would expel you for drinking wine or having boys stay over, the added privacy was a huge bonus. My roommate Ella and I quickly signed up. Ella and I liked walking on the trails in the evenings and usually headed back to our place just before sunset. Like most colleges, ours came with its fair share of ghost stories and tales of cryptids, but the woods had always been peaceful on our walks. Anyway, we were together, so we felt safe. One evening in late spring, we headed down a trail that veered further from the main road than the route we usually took. We walked along as usual, chatting and being silly. As we walked, the woods seemed to grow dark much quicker than usual. We were familiar with the sunset times, and it seemed far too early to be losing light. I told myself we had been mistaken about the time or that I was just imagining it. The trail was well worn, so even if it got dark, we'd be able to find our way back to the road easily. Then something started feeling off. I don't really know how else to explain it. It felt as if very suddenly we weren't safe and that we were being watched. Ella and I are both really talkative, so I knew she must be feeling something weird as well because neither of us was saying much as we walked. Anyone who has been to Georgia in warm months knows the woods here are loud. The cicadas alone can be deafening. At the start of our walk, we heard bugs and birds all around us. I don't know when it began, but I realized that the sound of insects had faded away and the woods around us had fallen silent. I kept walking because I didn't want to give in to an overactive imagination, but the sound of each step I took seemed to blast through the trees, announcing our presence. I want to say that I began to hear a rumble in the trees around us, but that isn't exactly true. I didn't hear anything, but the sense of something frustrated and threatening seemed to close in on all sides. The air felt heavy and close. I felt like I was going crazy because there was literally nothing happening that should have been causing me to feel that way. It was just absolute dread. I forced my feet forward because I felt certain I was overreacting, but my skin prickled. I jumped when Ella broke the silence by saying, do you want to turn around? Yes, I said without hesitating and spun on my heel. As I took my first step back toward the trailhead, I felt a sharp yank. Something pulled the hood of my jacket so hard that it fell halfway down my back and was at my elbows. Without speaking, Ella and I immediately bolted. We ran until we couldn't breathe. I was too scared to look back, but I felt eyes trained on us. We made it home and bolted the doors. No clue what happened, but that was our last hiking venture. Creature in the lakes of Finland. I was spending time in a summer house in the woods with my mother. The area is very much in the woods, but there is one digging area for gravel some kilometers away and a couple more summer houses. We can't see them though, so it's not like we're completely isolated. So we were leaving after being there a couple days, and I was looking at the lake in front of the summer house. I saw a swan probably like 70 to 80 meters away from the summer house in the lake, pretty close to the sleet, if that's the right word. I looked at the swan, and it started to form into a tall white thing. Like a tall white creature, and it stayed completely still on top of the water. Now I'm a logic person, so I started to doubt my eyesight and the lighting. I kept watching it, and it turned back into a swan. Like it shrank. It underwent another transformation, prompting me to call my mom for a closer inspection. While it was still looking like a swan, she was like, "It's just a swan," but when it turned into the tall white thing, my mom was quiet, and I asked how that could be explained, and she said she doesn't know. After that, it did it a couple times, and then it stayed as a swan and didn't turn into anything again. We left the summer house and didn't discuss it further. Well, if anything, it's a great fireplace story, but the thing that bothers me is that I actually saw it. I don't know how to explain it, and I want to explain it because the fact that there would be a creature like that would crush my viewing of life completely because that is paranormal. If anyone wants to explain this to me, like if it can be the lighting or something. It was just too tall to just be an illusion. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be typing this. I still go to the summer house a lot, and I spend there a lot of time. I always look around in the woods and stare at the lake. I kind of want to see it again. I suppose if it was actually real and not me and my mom tripping at the same time for some reason, it wouldn't be a ghost but some ancient creature that could have been one of the mythical creatures Finnish people feared or worshipped in ancient times. I don't really know. I really want to see it again because I'm in crisis about it. I can't believe it's real. I never believe people when they tell stories like that, but I saw it like I saw it with my own eyes. No bullshit, not a story, not a crappy video, like I saw it myself. There's no better proof than that. I'm going to the summer house tomorrow to celebrate my friend's birthday. I don't think the creature will ever show up again because I think that's the closest it's been to people. I think it tries to avoid people and accidentally went that close, or somehow I tell myself it's something from nature, like a rare animal or something. Also about the transforming how it looked like, so at some point the neck of the swan kind disappeared and the butt of the swan as well, so it kind of felt like I was dizzy, not literally, but like, when you see those videos of desert and the view is wavy because of the heat, I guess there was something like that. I was looking at it from afar but only the swan, not anything else, then the neck appeared thicker and higher, and the standing white entity was there actually just chilling, still on top of the water. This is just how I remembered it, like the transformation was smooth and you didn't even realize it till it was already standing. So I thought this was something that was also interesting, like, how does it do that? Also, that's something I'd want to know in a story like this. I'm 58, I've had a wild life. I spent the early 80s and into the 90s as an avid member of the California hardcore punk scene, going to gigs, getting into trouble, fighting, and boozing my life away when I wasn't working or sleeping. I've always loved horror and the paranormal, and I've always had an itch for the great outdoors. I'm an avid shooter and used to love hiking and biking my way through the Sierra Nevada mountains and foothills, usually alone in an attempt to find a connection with life. The universe? Something. Maybe God, if there is one, or the gods, for you pagans out there. At any rate, when I hit my late 20s, if there was nothing happening on the weekends music-wise, I'd often pack my shit and zip up to the mountains alone for the day or weekend. A favorite spot was a place called Rock Creek, late spring and early fall. There's rarely anyone else there, which is why I liked it, since it had bathrooms and was a nice place to camp but wasn't ideal when it was packed with people. It was mid-fall October that found me up there, I was 29 or 30. I had a Toyota truck with a shell that I'd sleep in, taking my bike usually, food and gear, and always at least a sidearm. I never paid attention to anyone's rules and regulations regarding firearms anyway. Nobody tells me I can't protect myself from human predators. I long ago vowed to never end up in someone's trunk. That's my philosophy, and carrying either my 9mm or 357 always made me feel not 100% alone or at the mercy of whatever. It gave the bear its claws, so to speak. Anyway, I'm up there for the weekend. There's one couple up there and the old ranger guy and me, so there's plenty of room to camp and no hassle. It was about 2 weeks before the campground closed for winter. I went up Friday night after work, got there about 10 p.m., unpacked a little to make room in the back of my truck, paid my fee and ate a late dinner, and crashed out. It was pretty damn cold. But it's nice to get away. I had a powerful AM/FM shortwave radio that I would listen to the Art Bell show on around that time, a favorite pastime of mine. The next day, I got up, had breakfast, met the older couple, and paid my respects to the ranger, who I had gotten to know from going up there so often. Grabbed the bike and rode for a few hours on familiar trails. Did some fishing and headed back to camp. All the usual evening stuff. Crashed again about 10. I woke up at one point because I had to pee. I kept a little jug that I'd go in so as to not have to freeze my ass off walking to the bathroom. Just after I fell asleep again, I woke up to the sound of big rig brakes on the curves of the road above the camp, a sound I had gotten used to. Then another sound that I could not figure out what. It was the famous whooping sound that gets attributed to the Bigfoot, although at the time I didn't know this. The noise wasn't close and was brief, but it stuck in my memory. At the time, I figured it was an owl. The simian nature of the noise never occurred to me. The rest of the weekend was uneventful, and time moved on. Fast forward several years later. One night I'm watching TV and Survivor Man is on, and it's the episode when he first heard that sound while collecting glasses or something. I'm eating dinner while watching, and as his story unfolds, I sit there for a second, thinking, WTF. The sound happens a few more times, and as it's happening, My hairs are raised up, and I'm starting to genuinely freak out. If you've seen that episode, you know what I mean. He doesn't like what he's hearing, and inside he knows what it is that's making the sound, and he's all alone in the mountains. In the meantime, my mind is back to the time at Rock Creek, the night I heard the exact, to the letter, same sound. There's no doubt in my mind, 110% of the sound was identical. I started crying, not out of sadness. I don't know why, honestly. I was scared, but in the middle of the city it's Bigfoot safe, it's the criminals you gotta look out for. Still, I replayed my night and that sound in my head over and over. I had heard of a Bigfoot and didn't know it until 20 odd years later. I thought about all the time I spent up there alone. There were a couple other times that I inexplicably felt a feeling of dread, borderline terror, that made me quickly leave the area I was in. I didn't hear or see anything. The feeling just washed over me that I don't belong where I'm at and I need to leave quickly. One of the times I was in such a scramble that I tripped over a rock and ate shit in a puddle before getting back up and hightailing it back to my truck. I always figured it was either my imagination, maybe a bad spirit, or possibly intuition. I don't know. But I never went back to those areas again. And after seeing that show on TV, that was the end of my love of the mountains. After that is when my interest in Bigfoot spiked. I was and continue to be both fascinated and horrified at the concept of a wood ape. I have zero desire to ever see one, hear one again, or have anything to do with one. In closing, I'm supposed to move to Yelm, Washington soon, and I'm not really looking forward to it. That's my story. Feel free to comment if you have something to share. In the summer of 1991, I was part of a NorCal grow operation in the shadow of Mount Shasta that was just riddled with weird activity. When I got my mental breaks, I would go deep solo camping 20 to 30 miles away from the grow, which was 40 to 60 miles away from any road. We would use staging areas for equipment drops, then use ATVs to move everything to the actual grow site, and these would take a day or more to move back and forth. My solo mental break trips would take me out to areas where maybe Native Americans have been. This particular trip, I got to an area where I could bunk for the night. I thought it might rain, so I posted up under a small rock ledge that would give me some cover if it rained but not obstruct any lines of sight, and it had my back. I always had a bug-out route just in case I had to bolt from my campsite. I needed to have at least one way out of my camp where I could grab my shit and roll. I wasn't in a position to have a firearm, but I had a compound bow that I was better than average using. I also had a quiver for arrows built into my pack. This bow was either on my back or in my sleeping bag next to me at all times. After making a fire, I unrolled my bag, ate some dehydrated food, got in my bag, and began to read. It was dark, but a huge full moon, and you could see pretty well. I was so tired I fell asleep quickly, but my internal security makes sure I'm a light sleeper to this day. Sometime later in the night, probably not more than a couple of hours because the fire was still going, I woke up to what sounded like movement just outside of my camp in the tree line. I didn't move, I just listened. Something was definitely moving around and circling the perimeter of my camp on what sounded like 2 legs, not 4, and it sounded like it was getting progressively closer. When it was on the opposite side of my bug-out route, I made the decision to bolt. I hop out of my bag, grab my bow and backpack, and run up my chosen route to the top of the ridge where I can clearly see the camp. I lay flat on top of the rocky ledge to try and get eyes on what was going on. The fire was still going, it wasn't raging but threw enough light that I could see everything. The fire, my sleeping bag I left, the entire site. After observing for about a minute, I clearly see something huge walking on 2 legs between my bag and the fire. I could feel every hair on my body stand up. This was no bear. In my mind, I was contemplating putting an arrow down range about 6 feet ahead of where this thing was moving. Immediately as soon as I had that thought, a huge rock, about 60 pounds, landed about 3 feet from my head. I wasn't alone. Whatever was in my camp, there was more than one, and the other was with me. I knew if it wanted to kill me with that rock it could have but didn't. I would never have seen it coming. Looking back, it was a message. To get the duck out of there, when the rock lands, I get up and throw myself down the other side of the ridge behind me head first. I roll and crash through the brush until the hill spits me out in the meadow on the bottom. I had maybe 30 seconds to collect myself when, over my head, I could hear something huge rolling, running down the chute I had just created with my body. I decided to run across the open meadow towards where I thought a fire tower would be 5 to 10 miles away that I saw on the way into the area. The reason I did this is because I thought something that was hiding might not follow me into the open, and I was right. I never turned around, but as I got to the other side of the meadow, I heard loud yelling and whooping. There were also definitely more than 2. It was a group. As I ran, the sounds got further behind me, and I was confident I wasn't being followed. That was a long night. One of many I would have that summer. The universe had a lot more to teach me. I never found that fire tower, but after 2 days I found the road and lucky got to a different fire watch station with a phone and radio. The rangers manning that station strangely were not surprised by my story. Within 3 days, I was back at our in-town staging base. I definitely can't say what town because I'm sure they are still growing. Having then spoke to friends who are Paiutes people from the area, they told me no one goes where I went because it's off limits for all reasons that I experienced. The ancient ones want no one there. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. When I was in high school, we had this Navy class called Njok, and I went through with the class long enough to go to the small 2-day boot camp they set up to get you ready for devil pups, then actual basic training, but back to the small boot camp, which was located down Elk River Road in Eureka, California, Humboldt County, at a lodge of sorts with an open field with apple trees lines up down the field so you can see all the way down the field through the apple trees, and at the end of the field are redwoods that are actually surrounding the whole area. Think of the area as a football field with rows of apple trees going down the center with a cabin and bunkers in the front. So during the first night after our fun activities, my buddy Chase Evanson, who is now a Marine, was on fire watch with me, so basically we had to walk around the property and make sure no one was around or trespassing, and if we were to see anyone, we'd yell Texas, and if it was another member of our group or any staff from the property, they were required to yell back stars, and if they didn't, well, that would be troubling because we were way out here in the middle of the redwood forest where nobody should be. So Evanson and I are walking around a huge tent the 50 plus of us had to put up to sleep in at the front of this field, and we're scanning the field when we see this man making a full sprint from the right side of the redwood forest across the field to the left side and disappear into the forest. Immediately I yell Texas, but the man keeps running, so I yell it again, nothing, and he's gone. But the weird thing was that this man was completely naked, clearly a male's body type, but I didn't see any genitals. The guy had to have been only 50 feet away, so I was able to see him very clearly. His skin was pale white and dirty, and his arms were abnormally long, the same with his hands and fingers. So at this point, once he disappeared into the forest, Evanson and I ran back to the cabin where our CO and captain are sleeping and woke up to tell them what we saw, and they just told us it was a deer that could not be out here, but to this day I still ask Evanson about that night just to remind myself that it was real. I know that this isn't a lot to go off of, but it's a true story that really happened to me and my buddy a while back. Back in 2012, a couple of friends and myself, 2 girls and 2 guys, went camping a few weeks after high school graduation. Located on private property in the woods of Brimfield, Massachusetts, there is a small campsite off the beaten path. Not many people know if this location or even the trails are here, but it takes about 3 miles of old dirt road driving and about 2 hours of hiking to reach the campsite. It's very scenic by the river on one side and the view of a small mountain on the other. We went out, we had a fun time, we ate, we drank, and we told scary stories by the campfire. We then went to sleep. Nothing weird or mysterious had happened. But then it did. At about 1 a.m., I woke up to sounds of mischief in the camp. I figured it was a raccoon or squirrel, and I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. At 3 a.m., all 4 of us shot up simultaneously. We were all stunned with fear and shock. About 20 from camp were the surrounding woods. We never mistakenly heard extremely loud singing. It was directed at the camp, and I had no idea what to do. But in fear of my friends, I grabbed my flashlight, swallowed my pride, and exited the tent with my friends following. You could not imagine how scared, lonely, and vulnerable we felt. I mean, who would be out here and singing out here? Pointing our flashlights into the woods, we couldn't see anything but someone was clearly singing. I thought, how strange that someone be this far out on private property and in the woods right here. It didn't make sense. So then the singing started to move, and the person was starting to move away from us. Just like in a movie, but in real life, we couldn't see the person, but all we could see was the leaves and brush moving as they moved. Once the person was far enough away, but still singing, I ordered my buddy to stir up the coals and the girls to put wood on the fire. Luckily, it quickly lit up, and the area became bright. After a while, the voice drifted off into the distance. We stayed up all morning and left at dawn. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there singing. I don't even know how to say this, but I think I saw a gnome in a national forest yesterday. I will be the first to admit I thought these types of cryptids were a joke and not real, and I've never been able to take them seriously. I am an outdoorsman and have been for 35 years. I grew up in the woods. I memorized trees for mushroom hunting for a living. I know every brook, stream, bush, berry grove, log, you name it. I'm on a forest road, and I'm on hour 9 of not a soul in sight. I gather some mushrooms and look up the road and see a rock has fallen from the loose, steep side of the mountain to the middle of the road. I make a mental note that I have to move it and not drive over it. I gather my mushrooms and get back to the car. I look up, and I see what appears to be a 2 or 2.5 foot tall, little brown thing walking from the side of the road over to the rock. My first logical thought is that it is a squirrel, but I see it is walking on 2 legs, appears to be wearing brown cloth or fur clothes, and is shaped like a human but very tiny. It's not scurrying either, it is ambling on 2 legs like a human would. Just casually walking like this is some normal, regular-ass thing, like monotonous work it does for a living. I don't believe my lying eyes. It has to be something else. I get back in the car and head up the road and see that the rock has been pushed back to the side of the road from whence it came. It had fallen off the hill, rolled to my left, then was sitting back on the other side of the road on the right. There are drag marks like someone slid it back. I look, I smell, I sense, and I listen. Nothing. I don't know where gnomes live, but the old partially logged section where I was looked pretty perfect for a clan of these things. Lots of places to hide, secluded, near water, plenty of routes of escape, and it would be easy to dig little holes in the mountain and be fortified against invaders. The side road into it was flooded and appears to do so regularly, so these little guys even have their own moat. I'm positive I'm overthinking this. It was a long drive back up the mountain, then down the mountain the other way, and some time home, and I can't pick this apart into anything else but being a tiny little forest man. I am adamant that I saw what I saw. It was near a military special interest zone allegedly blocked off due to some native butterflies, but I'm starting to wonder if this research area is really about butterflies after all. They send you to prison, ban you from parks, and give you a $5,000 fine if you take a single berry from inside that boundary. About 24 years ago, I was 8 years old. I was on a camping trip with my parents and little sister. We had just gotten to the campsite, and my parents told us to run and play while they set up the tent. My sister and I started just walking around the campsite and observing the other campers at other sites, seeing if there were any kids to play with. I truly do not know what happened next, but all of a sudden I found myself alone in the woods. It was like I was in a trance, and all of a sudden I came to and I was in the woods, alone, no sister in sight, no other campers in sight. In fact, I couldn't even see any campsites in the distance. I was so bewildered and started to get scared when I heard my mom's voice calling me to come back. Excited and relieved, I started walking in the direction of her voice. There was a road, but her voice was leading me away from it, so I followed. A few moments later, 2 park rangers drove up and asked if I was lost. I turned around and told them no. I heard my mom calling me, and I knew where I was going. They both looked really concerned and told me they would prefer if I got in their vehicle so they could drive me back to my campsite. Now I was concerned because the road was not where my mom's voice was coming from, and these were 2 strange men I didn't want to trust. One of them got out of the vehicle and told me that they would drive me past every single campsite on the property, and if I didn't see my family at any of them, they'd walk with me into the woods to find my mom. I finally agreed and got in the vehicle. On the way back, the park rangers told me that this area was restricted and I shouldn't sneak into it again because it's dangerous. I said nothing, mostly because I didn't want to admit that I completely blacked out and don't remember sneaking into anywhere. The drive back wasn't too long, but it was indeed in the opposite direction of my mom's voice. Finally, we pass my campsite, and I see my parents. I get out and thank them for returning me. Now here's the creepy part. Actually, 2 creepy parts. When I get back, my parents are like, "Welcome back." They were clearly not concerned by my absence. I told my mom what happened and said how crazy it was that her voice could carry so far from her actual location. She looked at me puzzled and said, "That wasn't me calling you, I only just realized you were gone a few minutes ago. It was only like 20 minutes ago I told you guys to run and play." So that got me freaked out because she said flatly she did not call my name whatsoever. And second, the car ride alone was 15 minutes. I made a point to take note of the clock on the ranger's vehicle to see how long the ride was. So either my mom is like the worst judge of time ever or I somehow covered the distance of a 15-minute car ride in 5 minutes on foot. She could have just misjudged the time, but it usually takes my parents about 45 minutes to set up the tent, and they were still working on it when I got back, so either way I covered a far distance in a really short amount of time. To this day I have no idea whose voice that was, what they/it wanted from me, or how I got there in the first place. When I found this 411 series in here, I got full head-to-toe chills because I know for a fact this is what happened to me, and it makes me feel so lucky those rangers found me. I was especially freaked out by the one where the little boy tells his grandma that he likes her better than the other grandma, referring to the grandma he saw in the woods with his family who looked exactly like her but was meaner. I just know in my soul that it's one of those situations. Anyway, thank you for listening. I love living near the Appalachian Mountains, old, beautiful, and sometimes spooky. The second largest state park in WV is about an hour and a half drive from me and is on the outskirts of the Appalachians. Hell, it may even be considered part of the Appalachians, Google could not confirm. At any rate, a couple of friends and I went hiking there a few years back. We were on the ridge all day and even managed to find an old family cemetery atop a big hill while out and about. It was getting dark, so instead of hiking through the woods on our way back, we made it to the road. It was only about 3 miles, but seemed like 12 lemao. During the hellacious trek back, we saw no cars, no signs of life, nobody, until around the halfway mark, we saw a handful of people up ahead, and it looked as though they were walking toward us. We were like, great, there's some people, maybe we are getting close to the campground, where we had parked. It was dusk, but still entirely visible out, and we watched as the handful of people, at least 5, began to disappear, until there was absolutely no one there. We got to where we had seen them, and to one side of the road was a sheer drop straight down into the valley below, and to the other side of the road was a steep rocky incline that would have been practically impossible to climb. There was nowhere for them to have gone. It was weird as hell, and I'll never forget that for as long as I live. My first and only paranormal experience in my life happened on the Pacific Crest Trail. For the record, I did not believe in paranormal stuff at all before this happened to me on trial. I was hiking in Mission Creek, the section between Cabazon and Big Bear Lake on my 2019 through hike, with 2 of my trail family members who can corroborate this story. The section got washed out pretty badly in a previous year, and it was a miserable hike up the mountain with a pretty destroyed trail, just trying to find the next car to find our way up the trail. We stopped for a lunch break at a creek when we met this man, clearly in hiker gear, in about his 50s, tall and slender, coming the wrong way down the trail. He stopped at us, and he looked pretty frazzled, and he asked if we saw his wife in the last section we hiked. We didn't see anyone matching his description, and we told him this, so he said he needed to find her and continued sobo down the trail. We wrapped up lunch and continued to hike up the trail. We were staying together pretty well because there were a lot of creek crossings that we needed to help each other get through. It was also tough to see the next car, so we hiked together to help spot them. Then, we see the guy again coming down the trail. We were pretty confused because we thought he went sobo and we didn't see him pass us again, but the road was wide and there were lots of trees and stuff, so he could have passed us again without us realizing. He approaches us and asks if we've seen his wife, and he didn't seem to recognize us from earlier. Okay, whatever, maybe he was hot and confused and forgot us. We told him again we didn't see her, and this time we tried to help him. He didn't seem to know what gut hooks was, and he had an old school Garmin and Reach that he didn't know how to text on. His wife's GPS was like 20 miles up the trail, which didn't make sense, and after a few minutes of trying to help, he gave up and headed sobo down the trail again. Later, we got out of the wash and caught the regular trail again, so my friends and I spread out a bit more while hiking. At one point I ducked behind a bush to go pee, and when I was done, I looked up and saw him above me on the trail looking around. Then he rushed down the trail, again sobo, past me without even seeing me. I caught back up, and my other 2 friends saw him too, and at this point we were a little freaked out. We kept hiking. I was always the slowest, so I was a little behind, and I caught up to my friends talking to him again. I was shocked again, because I had no idea how he was taking off sobo and then somehow circling around to find us again. This time, he said he was going to sit on a rock at a small campsite and wait for his wife to find him. We wished him luck and kept hiking. We saw him one final time, even though he said he was going to sit and wait, before making the final push out of Mission Creek. He was up on top of a large boulder off to the side of the trail, way ahead of us somehow, and he was scanning around looking for his wife. We didn't go close enough to talk to him, but at this point we were all thoroughly freaked out, and my one friend said, "You guys, I think he's a ghost, and he died here and is looking for his wife, who survived and got out." At that point, we decided to just book it out of there and not look back. We didn't see him again. Fast forward, we finally get to Big Bear and stay at the awesome hostel. The next morning we met up with some friends, who were a day ahead of us and didn't hike the creek with us, to get breakfast. We tell them our ghost story with enthusiasm, thinking we should all have a big laugh about how worked up we got over a guy who was clearly just a regular hiker. One of our friends asked if we Googled to see if any hikers recently died in Mission Creek. Uneasily, we did Google it. And what do we find? A news article of a hiker who died in Mission Creek of exposure. There was a picture attached. It was the man we saw in the wash. This is something my mom has been trying to figure out for nearly 40 years. She was on a trip to Medjugorje, where the primary language is Croatian, and she is from the US and speaks English. She was on a hike when she heard people screaming. No one else in her group heard the screaming. She ran across the mountain to the people screaming, and it was a woman praying over a convulsing man. My mother, in English, asked the woman what was happening, and the Croatian woman responded in English, saying that she needed her help and telling my mother to pray. They both prayed to our Father together in English. My mom stayed for several hours talking to and praying with this woman until the man appeared to be fine. I am leaving out details for the faint of heart, as my mother was participating in what we understand was an exorcism. After they all took a couple deep breaths, my mom tried to ask the woman if she would like help walking the man down the mountain. The woman looked incredibly confused and started speaking in Croatian. My mom doesn't know a single word of Croatian, and this woman doesn't know a single word of English, yet they were communicating in what they both thought was the language they spoke the last couple hours. They talked to the local priest with an interpreter for my mom and documented what they had seen and experienced that day. Both of their stories corroborated the others, even though there was no way they could have communicated to make something up. If you don't believe in possession, I totally understand your point of view, but I am mostly asking how to explain that to my mom they were speaking English, and to the other woman, they were speaking Croatian. I would love any insight at all. In my younger years, a group of friends and I wanted to get into hiking and were looking for somewhere simple to start. We'd heard good things about the Daybar Mountain Trail, New York, because kids are often taken hiking there, and it's said to be quite an enjoyable and laid-back hike. So a group of 3 of us went off on our first group hike. After about 30 to 40 minutes we got bored, and being young and stupid 20-something-year-old boys, we decided to go off trail a bit. We diverted into the surrounding forest, where we continued walking, cracking jokes the whole time, surrounded by nothing but thick forestation. Anyway, time got away from us, and we decided to turn back when it began to get a bit darker. As we were heading back to the trail, all 3 of us heard what sounded like a large bird, or bat, or something, flapping wings. All of us turned to the source of the noise, and about 30 feet in the air we saw what I can only describe as a human head. It had long, oily black hair and hollow, pale eyes. The skin, like something out of a horror movie, was drooping off the skull, hanging down the sides, and whatnot. Out of the side of the head, around the cheeks or ears, on white, bony tubes, kind of like the bottom of a leek, were smallish bat-like wings. It said nothing, assuming it was capable of speech, and didn't appear to notice us. It flew at speed deeper into the forest, and the 3 of us shit ourselves. Somehow we didn't scream, we just made our way back to the trail in near silence. There was no verbal WTF or whatever. We all seemed to understand what we had seen and quietly got in our cars and drove home. We didn't even bother completing the trail, and to this day we have only mentioned the site a few times. I don't really know what I saw, and I thought maybe someone could disprove or appreciate my experience. Strange camping stories. White Mountains creation, KH was camping at a national forest campground in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. On night, after his wife and daughter had fallen asleep, he was sitting by the fire when he heard a noise. This was different than the usual bear grunt. It was more like someone sneaking in the trees. I immediately grabbed the flashlight. What I saw haunts me even now. I saw a being in the trees. It was naked. It looked gray. And this sounds crazy, but it looked like a person, not really. It was hunched down, very muscular, and its legs were backward, like a bird's. Then it quickly turned and bounded off down the hill. I couldn't even follow it with my light. We left the next day. We went back to the same campground this year. Back to the same site. Again, I stayed up late, poking the fire and reading. It was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning when I heard a noise. I shined the light in that direction. That same creature, being, whatever was there. It looked exactly the same as I'd remembered from last year. It just sat there, crouched at the small tree line that separates the campsites. I slowly walked toward it. I tried not to make any threatening moves or gestures. I got to within 20 feet when it just jumped backward and disappeared. It looked like it might be 5 to 6 feet high if it stood up. It was definitely gray. It had human features, but more leathery. And its face was very wide. Its eyes were so big, and, even though they reflected light, they still looked black, like 2 intensely black marbles. Its legs were very muscular but turned backward. I know what I saw. It was real. Kevin. The light at the cabin. Northern Michigan is also the location of this strange event. Our Basil and a friend were at a riverside cabin one night, relaxing. They were about to retire to bed when I had just stretched out when a huge crack erupted from the woods. Both of us thought it was a branch or old tree that had fallen. After he turned off the living room light, we noticed that the light coming from the windows was abnormally strong. This sent our nerves to a new high. The light seemed to pulse several times and got so bright at one point you could have read a book by it. It couldn't have been a car, as we were almost a mile off the road on a dirt trail. Plus, the light came in through all the windows equally. Every so often we would hear a strange humming noise that penetrated that cabin. This lasted almost half an hour. We talked about just running out to the car and leaving, but neither one of us wanted to go outside. After the light went out, we sat on the couch, occasionally putting forth theories on what it could have been. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, there was another loud crack. We worried that the light might come back, but nothing happened. Recently, I finally found the time to sit down and read the missing 411 Eastern U.S. book I had ordered 2 years ago, and I wanted to share something that deeply disturbed me and piqued my interest. The pattern I found reminded me eerily of something that hit very close to home for me that some of you may remember, which I'll share here. In late January 2019, in Craven County, North Carolina, a young 3-year-old boy, Casey Hathaway, went missing and was lost in the woods for several days. He initially went missing while playing in his grandmother's backyard, and a large search was quickly started, even involving the FBI. Temperatures were low in the area, and the Craven County Sheriff's Department stated at the time that the area was treacherous, with some areas flooded and sinkholes forming, and that even some trained searchers were having difficulties. After following a tip from a local resident, the searchers found Casey hung up in a briar patch, from which they had to disentangle him after traveling through waist-deep water to reach him. He was only 50 yards from where he had initially gone missing, not surprisingly in an area that had been thoroughly searched multiple times. He was remarkably fine besides being cold, wet, and having some cuts and bruises. But more incredibly, when asked how he was able to survive, he stated to his family that a bear watched over him. I'm sure if any of you have read the missing 411 books, you'll likely recall some of the stories I'm about to share. 1. Roy Bildrian, age 2, went missing in October 1910 in Wisconsin. His mother stated that she saw him being carried off by a bear, which she pursued, and the bear dropped the child after encountering a wire fence. Interestingly, she stated in a different news article that the kidnapper had been a wolf. 2. Katie Flynn, age 3, went missing in the summer of 1868 in Michigan. Her father stated that he followed her tracks that he saw slowly merged with those of a huge black bear. Upon finding Katie, the searchers stated that they saw the huge black bear jump into the river and disappear when they approached her. In regards to the disappearance, Katie stated, "Big Dog came up to me, took me in his arms, and walked away with me." She further stated that the big black thing had approached her while she was playing and had taken her away with it by holding out its paw. It had also given Katie berries to eat out of its paw. 3. Missing girl Davis, age 2, went missing in May 1888 in New York. She was found after a full day of being missing and said that she had slept with a bear in the woods. But those aren't the only ones I find interesting and possibly related. Another very notable story is that of the disappearance of Dennis Martin, age 7, who disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park while on a family trip. He was last seen by his father as he ran up the trail they were hiking in an attempt to scare the adults in the party. A large search ensued, and he was unfortunately never found. But the part I found most interesting was that around the same time of Dennis Martin's disappearance, a family on another trail nearby heard a sickening scream, and one of the children in this family stated to his father that he spotted a bear in the bushes. Upon closer inspection, the father stated that it was not a bear but rather a rough-looking man hiding in the bushes. The father of Dennis Martin believed, based on proximity and a timeline, that it was possible that the man in the woods, who appeared like a bear to a child, was involved in the disappearance of his son. There's been other instances of men in the woods in the stories of the following. 1. Eloise Lindsay, age 22, in November 1989, she had planned to hike the Appalachian Trail alone for a week before meeting a friend, but she stated that 3 days into her hike, she knew she was being followed by a group of men that meant her harm. She said that she never saw the men but heard them regularly. She was missing for 16 days before being found by a hunter deep in the woods and later said that she had been trying to evade this group of men for 2 weeks before being found. 2. Karen Cooney, age 15, in July 1968, she was doing chores in her backyard in rural Pennsylvania when her brother heard her scream and family members quickly discovered that Karen was missing. After being found days 3 miles from her home, Karen stated that she remembered being chased from the house by a big man with a knife. He chased her for a long way through the woods until she said she fell asleep. 3. Florence Jackson, age 4, Missing for 4 days in September 1937 in Arkansas. Upon being discovered with a tomato and sheep sorrel in her hand, Florence stated that while being missing she had once hid in the woods when she saw two strange men, and a black man and woman picked her up and took her to a house deep in the woods. She further said that they had given her breakfast and told her to leave the next morning. Of note, she also stated she had slept in logs and on rocks and spent time calling out for her mother. I'm not saying I believe there are wild men running around the woods and abducting children for unknown reasons. Because, frankly, the idea disturbs me greatly, and there's many logistical flaws with that theory, in my opinion, that make it highly unlikely at best. But I did find the similarities between the stories and sightings to be worth noting and discussing because I'd love to hear some outside opinions and perspectives. I've had a few weird encounters I can't quite explain. There's actually a book called Monsters of the Northwoods I've been trying to find a copy of. I'll preface these stories by saying I'm not a God-fearing man, so to speak. I try to find a logical and reasonable explanation in everything. I've also been in the woods a lot, hiking, climbing, backpacking, camping. I also do lots of search and rescue work in the upstate NY area for a local SAR team. There are a couple places I do not like that give me a certain uneasy feeling. Faro Mountain Wilderness, Moose River Plains. Specifically MRP. Lots of weird shit happens there. Lots of people are missing with no trace at all. Weirds me out. A friend and I ended up staying in the Mackenzie Pond Wilderness near the boulders. A noise woke my friend up from a dead sleep not long before dawn. In turn, he woke me up and asked if I heard it. He looked genuinely freaked out. I hadn't heard it and hoped I would fall back asleep before I actually did hear it. I didn't make it. It had to have been some sort of large bird. Owl? Hawk? Raven? But I've heard foxes making screaming sounds too, so I dunno. But it made a god-awful noise. I couldn't at the time picture what kind of animal would make a noise like that. It seemed to move around outside the tent without much other noise and eventually ended up behind us. It had to have been a bird of sorts given how high up it seemed to be, but damn was that creepy sounding at the time. Especially to wake up from a dead sleep. I've heard weird noises that sound like voices in the woods by our camp in Brant Lake. Hiking by Lily Pond, Faro Mountain, etc. Not a single person around, and the voices seem to circle you with no visible movement in the woods. Certainly a head scratcher. I've thought for certain I would come across a group of people just over the next hill, no one around, no cars at the trailhead either. Sitting by the fire at our camp, the dogs started growling in the woods behind the fire. I heard this snorting/grunting kind of noise. I figured, well, that's definitely a bear. But it would move right to left in front of us in the woods, making no other noise in thick leaves or sticks. There's no way it didn't make any other noise. Then the dogs were facing and growling behind us. Okay, crap, it's moved. Suddenly it stopped, and the dogs needed to go inside the camper right now. That's extremely unusual for our dogs. I followed them, as I had no intention of finding out what made them so uneasy. Another one from our campground. Pretty sure this was a bear though. Sitting by the fire late at night, there's a small toddler playground across the road from our campsite. Heard a noise over that way, which would be directly behind the fire, so I couldn't really see much. Ended up hearing what sounded like someone picking up and dropping one of the kids' play toys over there. I immediately stood up and turned on the flashlight while simultaneously shitting myself because it's only like 25 feet away. The beam of my flashlight caused something just disappearing over a hill into the trees and a flipped over little tight plastic slide laying nearby. My guess now was a bear trying to get over it or by it and knocking it over, but goddamn did I shit myself and run inside. This happened back in 2021. My husband and 3 kids love us some primitive camping, and Loyola is the closest state forest that allows it. My husband and the dog left an hour before us, and he picked this site a bit off the trail. When we got there, he basically had camp set up, but my oldest, who was 12 at the time, and myself had a real uneasy feeling. We pushed through, and were enjoying our day together regardless. My son and I had to walk back to the car for something, which was maybe 1/4 mile from our site. Straight line, no way we could miss it. But as we walked, we realized nothing was familiar, and that unsettling feeling crept back in. Soon we came to a paved road, which shouldn't have been there. I even checked the map I had. The unsettling feeling just got worse. I wanted to keep walking because the car had to be here, but my son actually broke into tears, begging to turn around, so we did. After walking in the same direction, we arrived back at the camp. And when I set off again to the car, walking the same path I just had, I found the car. The rest of the afternoon, something felt off, and I noticed there were no bird sounds, no wind, it was just silent. I had such a bad feeling I wasn't able to settle down and begged everyone to go to bed before nightfall. I hardly slept that night due to the uneasy feeling and the deafening silence. But around 3:30ish I heard what sounded like mechanical whirling sound, maybe like a drone, but it was loud like it was right outside our tent. As soon as I went to get up and wake my husband, it just stopped, and the silence was back. It didn't wake anyone but my son and me, and by morning we were ready to pack up and go to another site. At the next site it was the typical forest, birds and insects, and it felt just fine. Also, I should note that my dog was an anxious mess the whole time we were at the first camp. He kept pacing and looking around and whimpering. Something was definitely up there. Scary camping stories. 1. Who followed us? This happened in 81 or 82. Not sure anymore. I had made friends with a fellow I worked with and offered to take him gigging for frogs. He was from the city and had never spent any time in the woods at night. The farm I had permission to do it on was only about a mile from my place. My friend showed up at 10:30 or so, and I gave him a gig and a flashlight. We decided to walk to the other farm. We didn't get far before we both heard something walking in the dark to the side of us. I've been in the woods all my life, and I've had plenty of deer follow me, but I wasn't going to tell him that. It was clear he was getting spooked. We climbed a fence and continued on. Then we heard something else climb the fence. Deer don't climb fences. I tried looking around with a flashlight, but he wanted none of it. We could see the house lights of the place we were going to, and he ran off on me and beat on the guy's door until they let him in. By the time I got there, Mr. Barber, the landowner, and his wife were out on the porch and wanted to know what was going on. Mr. Barber and I went back and had a look around but found nothing. My friend refused to walk back, and Mr. Barber gave us a ride back to my place. We never did find out what or who it was that was following us. My friend decided that frogging wasn't for him. He has also refused to go on several fishing trips I have invited him to. I can't say I was too comfortable with what happened, but I haven't let it stop me from frogging. Smoker. 2. The land remembers. One night I was camping near where an old river dam had been. I pulled the canoe in late, so I just draped the tarp over the canoe and crawled in underneath it and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of roaring water. I crawled up out from under the tarp, and the sound stopped. I thought I must have been imagining it, or it was the wind through the trees or something. I crawled back under the tent, and the sound started again. This time when I crawled out, it didn't stop. The sound got louder and louder. I realized that it sounded like water ripping through the woods. Even the dogs had their hair on end. I quick pulled the tarp off the canoe and dragged it up to the top of a ridge and waited to see what was making that noise. Then I heard the voices, men yelling and a dull thumping noise. I huddled down next to the boat, pulled the dogs close, and waited for the sun to come up to find out what was happening. Morning came, and there was nothing to see. To this day, I don't know what that was, but I have my ideas. I will not camp there ever again. I was told that the land remembers, and that's fine, I just don't need to be there when it's remembering. I live in Arizona. Think middle of nowhere, ranchers, BLM land, cowboys, what have you. Hell, you've probably never even heard of the town I live in. But this remoteness has its perks. One of them being lots of empty space to joyride around and have fun. However, my story begins before that. I've always believed in the paranormal and supernatural, even from a young age, but I've also always thought that I was above that stuff, somehow untouchable. I'm a little bit of an adrenaline junkie and like to tempt fate sometimes. So I decided to start looking into skinwalkers. Read everything I could get my hands on. And I started saying it quite frequently, too. And there's nothing that attracts a skinwalker quite like saying their name. And this is the very thing I did. But nothing came of it. And I wanted more. I wanted a reaction. I wanted to see one, or hear one, just have an experience. So me and 2 of my friends decided to go out skinwalker hunting. Dumb idea in and of itself, I know, but we're teenagers. What do you expect? So one day, we went out to a spot in the desert when the sun was setting and started walking. We had guns and thought that would be enough to bring one down if we saw it, but in hindsight, probably not. This is how it went. When we were all getting out of the car, one of my friends, friend 1, tripped and stumbled. As you would in this situation, he said damn it and recovered his footing. We get the rifles and shotgun out of the trunk and start out on our merry way, headlamps and flashlights in our pockets. After a few hours of walking, I start to notice something. Or rather, the lack of something. Noise. Even on the quietest nights where I live, there's owls hooting, insects chirping, what have you. None of that. If I had to guess how long that had been going on, I would have guessed about half an hour to an hour. Nothing major, but but something was nagging me in the back of my mind, just out of the range of conscious thought. I let it be, not bringing up my concern, and we kept walking. Up until we heard the rustling. We had gone about an hour without hearing anything, and all of a sudden we hear rustling like something's moving through the brush. Not a rabbit, or a coyote, but like a human. We all just stop. I raise my rifle and aim at where I thought I heard the noise from, until I heard friend 1 say "damn it" from behind me. My blood ran ice cold. Friend 1 was in front of me. I could see him. He turned around to look at me, just as confused as I was. I turn around to look at our other friend 2, behind me, only to see him looking at us confused. None of us have any idea what's going on. We hear a twig snap, and I raise my rifle again, but this time I don't know where to point it. Then we hear friend 1 scream "damn it." We all jump, and that's when we decide to just book it back to the car. As we run, we hear a woman yelling from far away, "Help." But we're getting out of there. We get back in the car and haul it away, but not before I see something I'll never forget. A pair of eyes reflecting the light from the taillights of the car, and a misshapen arm reaching out from the brush. When we get back to friend 2's house, we're all understandably shaken up. We don't want to talk about what happened, but we have to. We start putting the pieces together, and oh boy, we don't like the completed puzzle. Friend 1's voice was mimicked. That much is for certain. There was a predator there. I failed to recognize it then, but that's why everything was silent. Animals hide from predators. We were just too dumb to do the same. We were debating for a bit on if there was another person out there, but we all agreed that A, it was unlikely we could have ran into someone else, and B, if there was a person out there yelling for help, they wouldn't have lasted very long against a skinwalker anyway. Everything we experienced made us think we ran into a skinwalker. But things haven't been quite the same for me since then. I hear strange noises at night. I'll see something shift out of the corner of my eye when I'm out after dark. Even during the day, I can't help but feel I'm being watched, even when there's no humans around. And sometimes at night, I'll wake up when it's pitch dark and see my curtains fallen down, letting me see into the yard of my house. The porch light illuminates some of it, but just beyond where I know the fence is, I'll see eyes. Like how a cat's reflect light but the wrong color. The wrong shape. They're too high up to be any animal we have around here, but too low to be a human. I think it's that thing I saw out in the desert. And the Lord knows that those things can travel and hunt a person down. I ducked up bad. There's probably no recovering from this for a while. Please don't make the same mistakes I did. There's things out there, and not all of them are nice. I haven't really told many people this, but I've got my story to share. This started happening in 2020, I never noticed anything until 2 months ago. So my nan died in the hospital in 2020 after having a urinary tract infection and tripping over because of the meds and having an aneurysm. At first I felt no emotions until a few weeks later. I must say first I wasn't depressed or anything. A few months went by when I suddenly woke up from my sleep, feeling like I was being watched. I opened my eyes to see a creature in the corner of my roof. Being terrified, I grabbed my baseball bat, and it disappeared. The next night the same thing happened, except there was also a dude sitting at the end of my bed, chanting something unrecognizable. I was terrified but tried blocking it out to find the chanting getting louder. Over the next few years, this would continue happening less frequently. When I started seeing people on the street just disappear. I felt a gust of wind look behind me, and my nan was there. Anyway, the creepiest part of this story is what happened a couple months ago. I was on my marine biology camp for school when my mates a few cabins up came running down the hall telling us someone smacked their balcony door, so we checked and there were handprints. Me being curious, I decided to stay there for a bit, and sure enough it happened again. More handprints appeared, but there was no one there. This time a few other cabins were in the room along with the teacher when we heard a bang, and we physically saw the handprints appear on the glass, but almost as if the person doing it was invisible. My mates left that cabin, and I remember the light being left on. I curiously left my cabin to look under the door to see the light wasn't on and I could hear female voices. I knocked but had no answer. Thanks for listening. I love the woods and always have. The peace and serenity it brings me is unmatched. That being said, I experienced something that I still have trouble explaining. Hunting is really big in my hometown and the state in general, and so I decided that I would try and bag a deer 3 seasons ago. I set up my tree stand, cameras, put out some feed, and would sit out there for hours just waiting for some unlucky deer to walk by. The land that I had permission to hunt is near my family's home, so I could walk to my stand. The land surrounds a bridge for the railroad. The tracks are over the gravel road with a creek that floods all the time. In school, it was a favorite scary activity. The bridge has a lot of history because my town used to be a sundown town, and in the days of segregation, if a person of color was caught outside after the sun was down, they were hung from the bridge. Many lives were snuffed out under that bridge, and it's no surprise that it is the local haunt. So, I had been sitting in my chair, and the sun was quickly going down. It isn't safe to hunt after the sun goes down, regardless. Just as I was about to climb down, a small buck walked out of the tree line. I sat and watched him and noticed he was limping. His front leg was broken, and I was always taught to show mercy when you see something like this. So, I drew my bow and shot true. After the shot, he ran off, and I slowly climbed down to begin tracking the blood. After 30 minutes of no luck finding him, I decided to call my friend, who was a damn excellent tracker. When he showed up, we started to follow the trail again. By this time, the sun had gone down completely, and it was pitch black. After tracking for an hour or so, we finally spotted him laying at the base of a large tree. I had called my brother to bring his truck so we could bring the deer home and process it, so my friend Jay and I sat and waited for him to show up. Sitting in the pitch black, we were enjoying the silence when the silence was snapped by the pounding of footsteps. The footsteps were heavy and fast and were definitely not an animal. I was bipedal and was really fast. Jay and I sat there in awe, and I will never forget the look on Jay's face and the horror in his eyes. We decided to stand up and try to find out who or what was out here. We flipped on our headlamps and started yelling, "WHO's out here?" No response came, and the silence returned. No footsteps running away, and no other noise out here. My brother showed up soon after, and we loaded the deer up. Jay and I decided that it was probably one of the poor spirits that was stuck under the bridge and the deer blood attracted it, or maybe it was something else. Allegheny/Salamanca occurrences. Salamanca is my hometown, and I belong to the Seneca Nation, and we have an array of stories about the weeks there. They are not called the Enchanted Mountains for nothing. There is a part of the state park closer to Quaker Lake that is called Ghoulish Hill, which translates roughly to Witchlight Hill, where balls of light or orbs are seen regularly and are believed to be a bad medicine man teleporting for a lack of a better explanation. People have seen deer walking around on their back legs completely gutted here, as well as ghostly apparitions and sounds and other unnatural creatures. One story that comes to mind happened to my brother's best friend when he and a group of homies drove up there and parked their car and turned off the lights when they heard a woman scream a high-pitched scream, and they all scrambled to see where it was coming from, and when they returned back to their car, there were child handprints crawling up the windshield and a gold bowl placed directly on the hood of the car. They got out of there shortly after. I have also personally passed Ghoulish Hill in a vehicle riding in the back seat with two friends in the front seat, and as we passed the hill, I saw and felt a black embodiment of a person right next to me. This wasn't a shadow I could wave my hand through. There was literally someone in the back seat with me, and I could feel them plain as day. There's also been numerous UFO sightings above the woods here, as well as Bigfoot-type creatures, and there is a history of giants living in the woods. I know it sounds silly, but there is actual documentation that you can find where there were demolition efforts going on in the Allegheny State Park in the 1960s, I believe, and one of the workers discovered an entrance to a cave, and there were man-made tables and chairs in there that were 10 feet tall. So it leaves you to wonder what kind of beings are sitting at tables and chairs of this size? Shortly after his reporting, there were men in black driving black vehicles rolling through the small town of Salamanca, which, as you can imagine, has seemingly never happened before due to its irrelevant nature. They ended up blowing up the entrance to this cave, and whatever they were doing up there was never made public or put into the press. And on the note of Bigfoot, I also have a personal anecdote for that too. One night within the past decade, my parents were driving back from Olean to Salamanca, and they took the back road near Carlton and Kilbuck, and it was already nighttime when they began driving. They rounded a bend, and up ahead of them, maybe 50 yards away, was a yellow hazard sign, and they saw something on the left side of the road that was tall and dark brown, and they swear the thing took 2, perhaps 3 steps, and it was already across the entire road, and when it passed behind the yellow sign, you could still see its head above the sign. That's how tall this thing was. My parents stopped in their tracks completely in awe of whatever they just saw, and at that point it was already gone. Most of the paranormal experiences I've had in my entire life have been in Salamanca, New York. I have not lived there since 2011 and have been to all of the lower 48 states and halfway across Canada and have had a lot of weird shit happen to me, but Salamanca is something entirely different. I know that the stories the elders told us as kids were mostly to scare us into behaving, but there is truth to all of it. There is constant knocking coming from my bedroom drawer when I stay at my parents' house, and that aligns with our stories of little people. We have a powwow in July, and the way the water drums boom through the hills is something that you could never forget. But I have heard these drums all throughout the year, even when nobody is playing them, and that is intense in and of itself. I'd also like to mention one final story that happened at my grandma's house down Old Route 17. My grandma, my aunt, and two of my cousins were chilling in the living room one night watching TV and eating dinner when all of a sudden the dogs started going crazy and they heard footsteps on the front porch. They have this big wooden hutch built into the wall of the house that's shaped like a dumpster and is where they store their garbage before they bring it out to the road on garbage collection day. And when my cousin went out to check what it was, thinking it was just a raccoon or something, he started screaming, and my grandma and aunt came running to the door and saw an animal walking on his back legs with hooves and didn't really get a chance to catch his face. Let me tell you that there's virtually no goats, sheep, or even really livestock in the area like that, so seeing something like this is just as random as seeing it in New York City. There are cows 3 miles down the street at one specific farm, but they don't wander, and this most certainly wasn't a cow. This thing was able to jump off the top of the hutch and over the railing of the front porch and bolt into the woods upright. I really wish I knew what its torso and upper body look like, but at the same time I'm kind of grateful I don't. When my great-uncle built this specific house for my great-grandma, they were doing excavation work and found human bones in the process. But the thing is that these bones, the femur bone in particular, were more than double the size of an average human femur bone today. I'm not sure what this is indicative of, maybe our ancestors were just bigger people, but the fact that Graham's house was built on an unmarked grave is something that will always trip me out to this day. You can look up stories by Deuce Bowen or Mason Winfield, who document the creatures in the area very well. We have a cannibal named High Hat, serpents in Quaker Lake, long nose, talking animals, and more witches, for lack of a better word, than you can count. The serpents in Quaker Lake are genuinely accepted as truth at this point. We have known they existed before contact, but when Quaker Lake was created and the Allegheny River flooded our reservation, it became more prevalent and has appeared to non-natives more often. When you drive towards Steenburg on the 86, you cross the bridge over the Allegheny River, and all you see is the river every way you look, but in the 50s, it was part of our reservation, and whole families have lived out their existence there for generations. The Army Corps of Engineers decided to build a dam so Pittsburgh would stop flooding and removed all of these people from their homes, dug up the cemeteries, transported their bodies, and let the waters run rampant. So if that doesn't create a haunting atmosphere, I don't know what would. This is where you can see the serpent often. I could go on and on about personal stories and stories I have heard from family members and friends, but we would be here all day. I hope this answered some of your curiosity, and I'm definitely here if you have any questions or anything else. Back in the California desert about 3 years ago, when I was 11, I went camping and hunting with my grandpa, whom I haven't seen in ages, and my father, and we were at a property my grandfather owned that was infested with cougars. It was a beautiful desert, but it got really scary at night. We were all in this cabin and RV homes and planned to set up tents for fun and go hunting. The first night went pretty well, and nothing strange happened, that is, until the next day I went out to play with my cousins and saw the strangest footprints. They looked like dog prints but were way bigger. Us being stupid kids, we followed the trail, and after about 5 minutes of walking, my 2 cousins wanted to go back. I still wanted to venture off and see what I could find. I was a cocky little kid with nothing but adventure on my mind that was instantly changed when I walked for about 1 more minute and caved across this cave. I peeked my head in and found bones hung up inside and blood smeared on the walls like some kind of art. It was disgusting and smelled like death. I ran back to camp as fast as I could and told everyone, but of course they thought I wasn't serious, so they just brushed me off. I got a terrible sense when it struck 6 p.m. We heard demonic howling in the desert and just thought it was coyotes, but I still couldn't shake that feeling that something terrible was about to happen to me. So I slept inside the RV instead of the tent to this day. I am so glad I did because I stayed up that night and I had been looking out the window, and after about an hour I saw 2 devilish glowing eyes that I hadn't noticed until now. It had to have been watching me for hours. I never dropped down so fast in my life before. As I got up after a few minutes, it came where I could see it. My stomach dropped and my heart shattered. My eyes started tearing up. I saw it. I don't know what the hell it was, but from what I've seen online, it was a skinwalker. It looked like its limbs were double jointed, and they were long. It was walking on all 4s circling the tent when it struck the tent. It opened it up viciously and then exited and stood up on its hind legs. I was frozen at this point. It had to have been at least 6 feet 10 inches at least. I had never seen anything like it before, and I pray to God that I never see anything like it again. As it looked around, it saw me and stared me down. Now I know animals or whatever the hell that thing was could talk, but its eyes did more than words ever could as I looked in its eyes. It gave me the look of pure hatred and fury. I can promise that if I were in the tent that day, I wouldn't be here telling this story. It crouched back down, let out a howl, and ran off into the night. Obviously, I didn't get a wink of sleep the next day. I begged my parents to go home, and they said yes because we didn't live that far. Thankfully, we left because the next day my younger cousin had gone missing. I never told them why he did because I sounded stupid, but they thought maybe he got lost, but I know what really happened, and I'm sorry for him. 4 years later, they destroyed the property to build a construction site. I'm very grateful I left when I did. And you don't have to believe any of this, but it's my story and it's true, and if there's anything to learn from here, trust your gut, or it might get ripped apart. When I was very young and began riding my horse through the woods in 1973, I would at times hear these huge, heavy footfalls behind me. It was autumn in Arkansas, NLR, and Pulaski County on the outskirts of the city. Our house sat at the base of a huge hill, and the woods started about halfway up. If I continued riding, I'd end up in Camp Robinson, at the time a military ground they used for practice. Saying all that, I never saw a human or anyone practicing any military routine. But I was very used to the sound of the crackling branches, little animals scurrying about, and the echo of my horse's hoofs breaking twigs. This event happened several times and even seemed to follow me hundreds of miles when my parents moved us to northwest Arkansas in the Ozarks. I would be riding in the daytime midday and hear a huge footfall, like the heaviest sounding footstep ever, that would be almost in time with my horse's stride. So, I'd stop quickly and listen, and it would stop but a moment later so that I'd hear that last footstep. I even galloped the horse several times, and it would keep pace, but when I stopped abruptly, I'd hear a couple quick footfalls behind me. It terrified me. It's weird because my ears would prick like dogs, and I'd hear nothing else in the forest. No birds were chirping or even turkey buzzards flying around. The worst was once we moved to Strickler, Arkansas. Our 240 acres butted up to the national forest. If I'd been riding all day and was making it home late, I'd stick to the dirt road as the light of the sun grew dimmer. I'd hear those same heavy footsteps in the woods along the road. It's unexplainable the chills that ran up my spine. I was a seasoned outdoorsman by this time and went hiking as well, 1978-83. It never happened in the winter that I remember. I didn't see anything at the times listed, but it was more than obvious I was being stalked by something that was heavy enough to hear over the sound of my horse's 4 hooves and the leather saddle. This is the story of what happened to an ex-boyfriend and me when we decided to go camping at a local swimming hole in my hometown. I mentioned it to a friend of mine recently, and she suggested I share it. So, here we go. In 2015, in a small town in Central Florida, I had just graduated high school and started dating a young man who had just gotten out of the Marines. We had met through mutual friends and hit it off right away. His name was Lee, and he made me laugh and was a lot of fun. One of the things I loved about him was that he loved the outdoors like I did, and we spent much of that summer camping, swimming, and going to bonfires with friends. Typical summer activities in a small town. On one particular weekend, we were supposed to meet up with some friends at one of the local springs and go camping. However, when we arrived to the springs after I had gotten off work, all the camping spaces had already been filled. We weren't even allowed in the park due to how packed it was. We both were pretty bummed, but Lee, being the optimist he was, says, "Why don't we go a few miles down and camp out at Freak Creek?" Freak Creek was a pretty well-known party and swimming spot to the locals. It was a small docking area for canoes and such looking to paddle along the Alexander Springs River. You could also fish and swim off the banks. On the bank opposite where you would arrive, large rope swings hung off giant oak and pine trees that you could climb up and swing off. We had spent a lot of time there that summer with friends. It was a very fun place to be. During the day. Since I knew that area fairly well and there wasn't any chance of getting lost or running into really anyone we didn't know, I agreed. So, we left the springs and turned to head down the road. Once we got to the large service road, it was already getting pretty dark. The sandy access road that led there was barely big enough for 2 vehicles and had tall pine trees on each side with palm fronds and other foliage covering the forest floor. It seemed to drag on forever in the dark. Lee and I struck up a conversation as we drove and laughed as we barreled down the familiar path. After about getting halfway down, we could see something laying on the side of the road. I asked Lee to slow down, and as we approached it, I thought maybe someone had hit a deer. It wasn't until we got closer that I realized it was a small hound dog. We pulled over and slowly approached it. The dog lifted its head, and when it saw us, got up and whimpered and started coming toward us. She was clearly very hungry and skinny and looked like she had a pretty bad gash on her hind leg, like something had swatted at her. I assumed a black bear as they were rampant in this area, and a panther wouldn't have let her get away. I gently petted her head and reached for her collar. She was clearly a lost hunting dog. This was really common around this area. People would use hound dogs to hunt deer and hogs in Central Florida. Her collar had her name, Honey, and a phone number on it. "Hey, babe," I say to Lee as he stands a few steps behind me, "she's got a number on her collar. Can you please get my phone? I think we might still have some service." He says okay, and he soon comes back with my phone. I check my phone and thankfully still have 1 bar of service. I dial the number, and a man answers. I explain the situation, and he says that he was running his dogs earlier in the week but was an hour away at home now. However, he can come get her from Freak Creek in the morning from us. I offered to take her to the vet that night for her scrape, but he says he has a vet that he always goes to and would prefer to take her to him in the morning. So, with that, we load up the poor pup and continue heading to the creek. Once we were there, it was pitch black, not even the moon was out. Freak Creek was as barren as you could get. We only heard the crickets and cicadas humming around the area. There were no lights, no bathrooms, just a bear-proof trash can to the left of the roundabout where you could park and drop your canoes into the water. Lee parked the car to the right of the roundabout in a small parking area and started unloading our tent and cooler. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and held it up so I could inspect Honey's cut. It didn't look all that awful now that I got a closer look. Just one long scrape up her haunch. I carried her down to the water, illuminated in the car's headlights, and set her down so she could get a drink. She drank for a while and then looked up and gave me a big lick. When we walked back up to Lee, he had set the tent up and was gathering small sticks and pine needles to start a fire. I helped, and soon we were sitting next to a warm fire, Honey laying on my lap, chatting as we ate some chips and talked about everything and nothing. After a few hours, I decided it was time for bed. It was around 1 a.m. at this time, and with the hum of the wildlife, I was getting really tired. We crawled into the tent, positioning Honey at our feet, and zipped up the tent to keep the mosquitoes out. After getting situated, it didn't take long until we were both quickly asleep. I woke up suddenly and sat upright. I wasn't quite sure what had woken me up, but as my eyes somewhat adjusted to what little light there was, I was startled by Honey. She was standing up, her eyes fixed on the zipper to the tent. She was growling, and her hackles were raised. My heart started to beat wildly. If there was one thing I learned from growing up in this area, it was that when your dog started acting weird, something dangerous was around. Now what that thing was, I wasn't sure. It could have been a raccoon, a panther, a bear, or heck even a snake. But all I knew was that there was something outside my tent that she wasn't happy about. I turned and shook Lee awake and reached for his pistol he had brought in my purse. "What?" he said, still very groggy from being startled awake. "Shh," I hissed at him and handed him his gun. He looked at me confused, and I pointed to the dog and then to the outside. "I think there's something outside. Honey is being really weird," I whispered as quietly as I could. Lee rolled his eyes and looked at me in a judgmental way. "Babe, we don't know this dog. I could be a moth hitting the side of the tent for all we know." He laid back down onto his sleeping bag and set the pistol next to him. "Just go back to sleep, you're working yourself up for no reason." He was cut off by a sound from outside the tent. We could tell it came from across the roundabout. Something moving in the brush, next to the large metal trash bins. Again, Honey let out a low growl. Lee sat up quickly and grabbed his pistol again. "That sounded big," he said, now looking worried. "Something woke me up. I'm telling you there is something out there. We need to leave." "We can't leave. We have a ton of stuff laid out, and her owner is going to be here in the morning." He pointed to Honey and checked the barrel of his gun. "I'm scared." "Shh," Lee stopped me and held up his hand. We sat there quietly, listening as intensely as we could, as we heard whatever was on the other side of the clearing move through the brush. I didn't think it was a panther. They were very quiet and stealthy when they walked. But it could definitely be a bear. They tend to push more brush aside when they move. We did have some food that evening, and we put it back in the cooler and not into the car. I looked nervously at Lee. He sat up on his knees and crawled down next to Honey, who still hadn't moved from her spot. "I'm going to open the tent and take a look, hand me the flashlight." He tells me with his hand on the zipper. "Are you kidding me? Don't open the zipper," I say, trying to keep my voice down. He waves his hand at me and demands I hand him the flashlight. Begrudgingly, I hand him the flashlight, and he slowly starts to unzip the tent opening and flips on the light. As soon as the light came out of the tent, we heard a very loud rustling of a brush, and something hit the side of the trash can on the other side of the clearing, and then nothing. Honey let out a bark but stayed behind Lee. "What do you see?" I asked Lee, my heart feeling like it's about to beat out of my chest. "Nothing," he said. "But I heard something move," I said back, confused and now terrified. "I know, but I don't see anything," he said, looking back at me. We both sat there in silence, listening to Honey continue to growl and stare out the tent, unmoving. Should I let her out after it? Lee asked me. Taken aback, I responded with. Are you kidding me? No. We don't know what's out there, Lee, don't put the dog out there. Okay, he said, zipping up the tent and turning off the flashlight. As soon as the flashlight was off, it suddenly became extremely dark again. I sat with my knees to my chest in the very center of the tent. Lee is sitting back to back with me and Honey still standing and starting at the entrance. Let's just calm down, Lee said, although I could hear him breathing hard. This is stupid, it's probably just a deer or something. Yeah, you're right. It's just a deer or something, I reply. I checked my phone. It was around 3:30 a.m. Only another 2.5 hours until daylight started coming in. I let out a small scream as the brush moved again, and Honey barked twice and growled loud. I grabbed Lee's hand and covered my mouth with my other hand. Something about this didn't feel right. This didn't feel like wildlife. This didn't feel like an encounter with an animal, and I was terrified. We heard whatever it was emerge from the brush and then the softest sound of steps on the sand. Look out there, what is it? I implored Lee. I'm not looking out again, you look out. He replied. You're a Marine, Lee. Just look out there. Fuck no. I want to go home. We stopped talking as we heard a twig snap maybe halfway across the clearing, only about 40 feet. I felt like I was going to have a heart attack. I kept telling myself this isn't normal. This isn't normal. I had come into contact with deer, bears, panthers, bobcats, raccoons, opossums, everything, and this was no animal. I think it's a person, I say softly. Lee looked over his shoulder at me. Okay, so what? He said, that's still really weird. Why wouldn't he call out to us? I sat there and listened again. The sounds had stopped. After listening for a few more minutes, I decided that if it was a person, that the only thing that was going to matter to them was one thing. Hey, I yelled as loud as I could. A sudden, sharp hit from Lee's elbows to my ribs stopped me. What are you doing? He said worriedly. I could tell he was just as scared as I was. So much for a Marine. Growing a pair, I said and called out again, hey, a hole. We have a gun, and we will use it. You better move along, we know you're out there. I'll shoot you if you get anywhere near this tent. And we have a dog, we know you're there. I could barely hear anything over the pounding in my ears. I could feel Lee shaking just as much as I was. Honey's demeanor suddenly changed. Instead of up and growling, she stopped and cowardly went down to the bottom of the tent. She seemed to be trying to hide. Lee pressed against me as we both went motionless, hearing a step not 5 feet away from us, onto the small pile of twigs we had sitting next to the fire. Tears started to form in my eyes. This area was known for its drug use, and the last thing I wanted was to come across some psycho addict looking for money. We heard what sounded like our cooler opening then slamming shut. We smelled something awful outside, like a garbage bag that had been left in the can too long. Lee cocked the gun, and the sound suddenly stopped. I felt like I was going to pass out. My heart was pounding, I couldn't control my breath. I was trying to be quiet and listen, but everything in me told me to get out, to get away. Lee held the gun to the upper side of the tent for a warning shot, and I plugged my ears. One loud bang rang out, and within seconds of the shot we heard something take off across the clearing and splash into the water, and then silence again. My ears were still ringing as I turned to Lee. Well, we warned him, I said. Lee just stared at me. We both were shaking, but Honey seemed to be feeling better. We all sat there, still listening, but no other noises came. We sat there, and we stayed sitting there until morning arrived. As soon as the warm grayish light of dawn rose, we were out of the tent and searching the sand for footprints. Sand doesn't really hold footprints well, though. It shifts and moves, and nothing really keeps any shapes. But once I made my way down to the water, I could clearly see several large, human footprints in the mud next to the water's edge. It was pressed deep, as though someone had jumped out from that spot, and when I put my foot next to it, it was almost double my size. I stared out into the foggy trees across the small river and searched the bank as hard as I could for any sign that somebody that big had climbed out, but I could see no spot. The only thing I noticed was that one of the rope swings that hung from the tree on the right had been snapped in half. One end was in the water, the other end was on the bank. As we packed up our stuff, Honey's owner arrived for her and thanked us for picking her up. We mentioned how glad we were that she had been with us last night and told the man what we had experienced. He stared at us confused as he loaded up Honey into her box in the bed of his truck. When I mentioned the smell, He looked at me and smiled. "Sounds like y'all had a run-in with the skunk ape," he laughed. "The what?" we both said together. "The skunk ape. You know, Sasquatch?" We nodded but were still confused. Skunk ape is like Sasquatch's stinky cousin. They say there's one who lives in the Ocala National Forest. Next time you go camping, better stick to the springs, alright? You never know what might be lurking around a place like Freak Creek at night. He thanked us again for taking care of Honey and left a few minutes later. We finished packing up our things quickly and headed home ourselves. I stared in the review mirror as we drove away and took a deep breath. "So, a skunk ape, huh?" I mumbled. "Yeah. Skunk ape," Lee replied. "It's been 8 years and I've never been back and don't ever want to go back. At least not at night." In 2018, I hiked from Mexico to Canada on the Pacific Crest Trail. I was somewhere in Northern California and had been pushing high 20 low 30 mile days for the last couple of weeks. I had decided to push it about 35 miles one day to a flat looking area that on the map looked like it'd have good camping next to a Forest Service road. I found a flat spot amongst the trees, maybe 50 feet from the dirt road. Around 8 p.m. nobody else around for miles, for all I know. About an hour later, I hear what sounds like a large animal walking maybe 30 feet from my tent and making these strange huffing sounds. It then sounds like it's scratching at trees all around me. Just pacing around, huffing and scratching at all the trees. I ignore it and fall asleep. 35 miles was a lot for me. Maybe about a half hour later it comes a bit closer to my tent and does the same thing with the huffing and scratching at all of the trees. I must have fallen asleep and woken up around 4 or 5 times to this thing apparently angry at my presence, just tearing all the trees and angrily huffing. I decided about midnight to just pack it up and start hiking after frustratingly not being allowed to just sink into dreamland. As I'm packing up my tent and retrieving my food bag from the tree it was hanging in, I see 2 eyes by the light of my headlamp just peering over at me, not moving or making any noise. Whatever it was just sat there and watched me. I ended up night hiking a few more miles and just cowboy camping without a tent, under the stars, on a rocky, exposed outcropping. Making it a total of 38.5 miles for that day and only sleeping for 3 hours. The next day I woke up and only managed 22 miles, a short day for what I was used to at that point, before feeling like I was about to collapse. The next day I managed 30 miles and hitched into the town of Mount Shasta, California, where I splurged on a bed and breakfast for 2 nights. Man, I miss that trail. I was pet sitting for my friend in the summer of 2013 up north in Queensland, Australia. She had moved into a sort of small holding right on the edge of a village with a huge garden that backed onto trees. At the time she had the right menagerie, chickens, ducks, a couple of Shetlands, cats, and 4 black retrievers, 3 fully grown and 1 half-grown puppy. Originally my husband was going to come with me as a little holiday, but the dates she ended up having to go away for work clashed with a couple of his medical appointments, so he stayed at home with our dog and I went to pet sit alone. It was about halfway through my stay, a couple of nights to go. Late evening, already dark, when I heard a massive commotion from the chicken shed, banging and thumping. I assumed a fox or something had gotten in, so I went out to check. As I was halfway across the garden, the noise stopped instantly, as if it had been shut off. By the time I got to the shed, it was calm, and the chickens were all settled, mostly asleep. No sign of any intruder or disturbance at all, nothing to explain the noise or any indication that the chickens had made a noise. As I went back in the house, a small black shape ran past me out of the back door, and I realized the puppy must have gotten out. It streaked across the garden and off toward the woods. Cue much cursing, then calling her name in vain. More cursing when she didn't come back. I grabbed a torch and put one of the other dogs on the lead, partly for protection, partly because I thought the pup was more likely to come back if I had one of her canine companions with me, and partly because I didn't fancy my chances of finding my way back to the house on my own even though there were a couple of vague paths that I'd followed when walking the dogs throughout the week. Off we walked into the wood along one of these paths, me calling the dogs names at intervals and trying not to imagine murderers behind every tree trunk. We got to a point where it felt like the trees were starting to thin out, and I remember thinking that I didn't remember a clearing on this path, and we must have gone wrong somewhere when the dog with me slowed right down and started to resist going forward. I tried to move her along, while my stomach suddenly dropped like a stone, and she started growling, a really low, serious rumbling growl. By this time, I was practically shitting myself. I tried shining the torch ahead, but the beam just sort of bounced back off the darkness, if that makes sense. I got the sense of something, or somethings, moving but just sinuous, deeper black shapes against the blackness and always on the periphery of vision. The hairs on my arms are standing up again, just remembering how completely and utterly terrified I was. I have honestly never known a feeling like it. At this point the dog sank right down, still growling, hackles up, and refused to budge. I muttered something like, "Jesus, you have got to be kidding me," and this ugly, gurgling, inhuman sort of voice hissed, right up close as if someone were very next to me, "Don't say that name." At the same time, there was a horrible snickering sort of laugh. I can't express how utterly petrified I was. I can't remember having any coherent thoughts apart from the word evil. That's the only clear thing I can remember. Me and the dog were frozen to the spot with pure fear. Then a different voice, really commanding, said, "Go back." Wherever it came from, it did the trick. Me and the dog turned and legged it back through the woods. She basically towed me. I just clung onto her lead, stumbling to keep up and sobbing with fear. I lost the torch somewhere on that wild run, but there was no way I was stopping to find it. How I didn't run blindly into a tree I'll never know. She guided me, I guess. I can remember thinking desperately that I could not let go of her lead or they would get me. When we got back to the garden, she suddenly stopped. I did fall over her this time, onto my hands and knees, turned around and started snarling, proper teeth bared, rabid-looking snarls, back at the trees in the darkness. I thought I heard the snickering again, but the blood was pounding in my ears so hard I can't be sure. I scrambled up and ran to the back door, and she followed me, but backing and snarling all the way as if holding something at bay. Oh, and the chicken shed was banging and thumping again. I got the back door open, me and her belted in, and I slammed home every bolt behind us. The other dogs left behind were staring at the door and growling too with their hackles up, and when I saw all three of them, puppy included, acting like that, I started to cry properly because I honestly thought I was trapped in some horror film nightmare and was going to die. I still don't know, what the black shape was that ran past me out of the house and triggered all of this because the puppy was right there in the kitchen. Anyway, I made sure every door and window was locked and bolted, I turned on every light in the house, and I wandered around, mumbling all sorts of weird, half-religious, half-spiritual shit to ward off evil spirits. Gradually the dogs settled down and stopped growling, and eventually stopped glancing at the door. Funnily enough, I didn't sleep for 1 second that night, and I rang my husband and begged him to come over the last couple of days. I know I didn't dream it because I was covered in scratches from running through the woods and had grazed hands from where I fell over the dog in the garden. Nothing like that has happened before or since, and I hope it never, ever does. It was the single most horrible, terrifying experience of my entire life. I grew up in Glens Falls. One night a good friend of mine, Lisa, and I decided to take a random drive into the woods and into the night one evening to just listen to tunes and explore. We headed north and drove for about 35 to 40 minutes in and out of small towns, villages, and long stretches of nothing but turns and trees on backcountry roads. After a while, we came to a row of individual houses, about 10 in all, and I slowed down because something seemed off. I pulled over, and we decided to get out and look around. The first thing that caught my eye is that each of the cars in the driveway looked like they were from the 50s, this was the early 90s. While it wouldn't be that odd, what I finally noticed was that each of these cars looked relatively new and not rusted out junkers. I pointed this out to Lisa, and she backed up my claim to me. A few of the houses had TVs on, you could see the glow in the windows. Each TV that we could see was playing in dark rooms with no other lights on, and I swear, each one was of a black and white show. I saw no colors in the images that we could see. We could see this from the street, there was no sidewalk, so in my mind, we didn't come off as peeping toms, so I'd try to see in where I could and the few where I could see the TV, it was definitely a B&W program. After a few minutes, we both started to get nervous. We didn't see any people walking around, but there were signs of something. There were no stop lights that we could see, but there was a collection of street lights on poles that gave off a very yellowish tint, but the fixtures on top didn't look like the ones at my place. They were much more ornate. And even though everything had this yellow, amberish glow, something made me feel like we should get out of there quickly. Lisa had been getting jitterier as the minutes went by, and I finally cracked as well. We swiftly made our way back to my car and went back the way we came, but since this was the age before cell phones and GPS, it probably took us an hour before we saw a landmark we could recognize in the night, which led us back to the streets we could use to take us back home. For about the next 15 years, whenever I found myself back there, I had eventually moved to VT, then DC, then out to LA and then Vegas, but am now in Seattle. First she and I would try and drive back to the spot, and in the years after our friendship ended, I'd still get in my car once each trip to find that strip of road, and I've never found it again. We weren't drunk nor high, just out for a drive. But I'll never forget the feel of walking in the street under those street lamps. Something was definitely not right. Me, my brother, and his girlfriend went camping one night. We were walking through the woods trying to pick a good spot. The night was pitch black, and the cool wind was rustling in the trees above us. The soft leaves on the floor didn't even crack when you stepped on them. As we were walking, we turned our torches, and the sight of an ancient wall full of old-looking rocks, stones, and cement spooked us, as it was all of a sudden right next to us. We got closer to it, wondering what it was. So we walked close enough to touch it, and it's huge and defiantly abandoned. We walk around following it, and it ends up having a part of it broken, so you were able to climb over it. Having stepped over the broken parts of the wall, we realized it was a very old church/crypt type thing. There were cracking, flaked gravestones from the 1700s that we were only just about able to read, and we went through them one by one, reading the names of the people when they were born and when they died. The world around us became very still, quiet, and cold. It felt like we were being watched all of a sudden. The darkness grew blacker around us and gave you the feeling as if something terrible was going to happen. It was the weirdest feeling I've ever felt. We all looked at each other as to say, "Duck this shit," and we started to leave panic in our footsteps and scramble not to be last. As soon as we left the inside of the ruin, the noise of the wind came back, and it grew warmer. We didn't camp in the woods. In the end, we went to McDonald's and then went home. Later, we found out that the woods we entered were famous for being haunted, and people say a woman dressed in gray, the Gray Lady, sometimes stops buses on the local road and gets on when the driver looks back to see her. She's gone. Who knows, but I'll never forget that experience. I'm so glad none of us were disrespectful towards the graves. We went back to the woods a couple weeks later in the daytime and couldn't find the ruin, graves, or anything. Mount Misery, New York. Mount Misery is a vast 854-acre wooded area in Huntington, New York. Its name doesn't derive from the many legends attached to the property. In 1653, local Indians sold the land to the settlers. The Indians sold them what they believed to be cursed land. They claimed evil spirits roamed the land. There were rumors of strange lights and sightings of a man-beast or hellhound-like creature with glowing red eyes. The settlers soon realized the land was no good for growing crops. They primarily used it as a trade route. The rough terrain and steep hill made it difficult for wagons to pass. Thus, it became known as Mount Misery. In 1840, a hospital was built for the insane. Not long after the hospital was built, there was a fire, and it burned down to the foundation, killing many of the patients. About 15 years later, the hospital was rebuilt. Some reported the smell of a burning building, and the screams of the victims were heard during the night. The new hospital burned down only 5 months after being built. Mount Misery is believed to be rather paranormally active. There have been sightings of a lady in white. No one knows for sure who this spirit may be, but there's speculation she might have been a patient in the mental hospital. Actually, some believe she caused one of the fires and was among the patients who died in the fire. She is seen walking alongside the road and even likes jumping in front of cars. There are also tales of an elderly male spirit who carries around a wicker basket full of decapitated heads. Some witnesses traveling down Sweet Hollow Road have encountered the spirit of a fallen police officer. He was shot in the head and killed during a routine traffic stop. Even after death, he still pulls cars over. You don't notice anything wrong until you get a peek at what is missing, the back of his head. There are stories of a girl who was hit and killed by a passing car while trying to fix a flat in the 1970s. This supposedly took place directly under the Northern State Overpass. They say if you park your car there at night, shut off the lights, and put it in neutral, she'll push your car until you clear the overpass. Witnesses have reported seeing children hanging from the Northern State Overpass on occasion. Children believed to have ended themselves there and may not have been the only ones. There is a story of a young girl who was supposedly attending a nearby horseback riding camp. She was allegedly hurt by the counselors. When she told her father, he didn't believe her. In a rage, she killed them all and then hung herself from the bridge. Spirits are not the only things wandering the mountain. There have also been sightings of UFOs in the area and strange visits from men in black to the locals after each sighting. 2. Large black dog. My friends and I have been going to the Misery for years, since high school really, to get a scare. We used to read up on paranormal on the computer and get freaked out and curious, so we would go drive around. A few times, it was real people, not the paranormal, that scared us. We had a car riding so close behind us that I had to speed up, and they followed us a long way at too high a speed for the winding roads. We were scared and were about to call the police when they suddenly veered off and left us alone on the pitch black road again. Another time we were on Sweet Hollow Road when a truck stopped dead in front of us and shut his headlights off. If you've been there, you know the road is only about a car and a half wide. You have to be careful and move over at a stop to pass each other. We didn't know if he was going to shoot us or what. I mustered the courage to try and fit around him, which I did, and slowly we wedged by. He stared at us the whole time and stayed there until he vanished out of sight in our rear view. The only paranormal thing that has happened to me there was driving up to the fallen trees at the beginning of the woods at Mount Misery Road. 2 friends of mine were with me, 1 girl and 1 guy. We were just driving and talking when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a big black dog running down one of the driveways. He went right past the garbage pails on the curb, and that's when I realized he wasn't stopping. Scared I might hit him, I jammed on my brakes. That's when we heard the thud. He ran smack into the side of my car, and I saw his body on the ground through the window. We were so freaked I made our guy friend get out and see if it was dead. He walked around to the side of the car, looked confused, walked around the back of the car, hopped in, and said, "Go." I listened and headed towards Sweet Hollow Road to leave instead of continuing to the woods. We were silent until I turned on Old Country Road. That's when he told me there was nothing there, no dog. It was unbelievable. I know what I saw. We all heard the thud. But nothing. It was crazy, weird, I felt saddened, I don't know why. We didn't go back there for a while. A few times we went, we even got out and walked. I don't recommend that. It's dangerous to walk in the woods and in any area at night. I wanted to share my stories. It's such an intriguing area. It has history. No matter what we experienced there, it always drew us back. I was just listening to another video here and got a flashback to something abundantly strange that happened to me as a kid. Figured I'd share, otherwise, I'll probably forget it for another 20 years again. My parents took me and my brother camping. I guess the place is still there, Nelson's family campground along Hales Brook in East Hampton, Connecticut. My brother and I used to slip quarters in the arcade machines they had in this log cabin main office. We loved it. The trip itself was uneventful. Mom and Dad were constantly nagging each other and occasionally fighting. Dad took us fishing. We didn't catch anything, and he was kind of being a dick. My brother and I were in Scouts, so we were familiar with the outdoors. We went fishing and camping all the time with our uncle, who took us on more backwoods kind of trips. This was a breeze for us. It's like 4 a.m. one of the nights, and I gotta pee. I've pretty much seen it all, and the campground is safe, and all I have to worry about is skunks or possums. I put on a jacket and crawl out of the tent and walk over to the bushes. I'm standing there, dick in hand, and I see this animal head with glowing green eyes low in the bushes about 20 feet out, maybe a foot or 2 from the ground. I assume it's a possum, so I start to pee. And then I remember thinking, wow, that possum actually really looks like an alien, but if it were a giant bug. My eyes adjust, and I expect a possum face to appear, but nope, an alien, but if it looked like a praying mantis. It kind of sinks in how strange it is that the eyes are glowing green and not yellow, like bioluminescence and not a reflection. I recall it reminding me of fireflies. And then my eyes actually adjust, and I see that not only am I right, but I also see its long, spindly arms. It's laying there in a position like it was doing push-ups. Its otherworldly and strangely long arms are bent at the elbow, which, when bent, sit higher than its head. It sort of looks like a long letter M. I kind of digest all of this, as it were. I'm not dreaming, so I should probably panic, but I realize if it's an alien that they're only like 3 or 4 feet tall according to lore, so I don't care, I'll just kick its ass. And then it stands up. Well, the head elevates. The arms straighten. Maybe it's just a human after all and some gangly creep. But the head keeps elevating. It would have had to have been 9 or 10 feet tall by the time it was done standing up. I was just frozen, trying to tell myself how not real this was or the millions of things it could be. Then I realize. Nope. What you see here is what you get, you're looking at exactly what you think you're looking at. I'm like 20 feet from this 10-foot tall mantis alien with glowing green eyes, and it's just me and him. Finally, I scream like my life depended on it, because it probably did, then just everything kind of gets hazy. I remember making it to the tent and hiding in my sleeping bag, and my brother is reacting frantically. My parents are upset that I woke up the entire campground. I tell them what happened, and they walk over where it was, and I see it would have for sure been a few feet taller than adults, and I feel like I'm about to be sick. Meanwhile, I'm expecting a long, gangly arm to dart out of the brush and snag one of them. I want to believe it was a dream or night terror, but my brother harassed me about it for a good 10 years before he died. I guess the most unsettling part of it all was how confident this thing was, like I was just inconsequential to it, and it was observing me with disdain. I was just this gross nothing to it, like it could eat me, but thank you or no thank you. I don't know why I felt that way. This happened to me and a friend of mine. The two of us spent a pretty good deal of time exploring those woods, and I never found them particularly frightening. There was a trail going through them, which I guess probably used to be an old country road, and along one stretch of this was a valley between two hills where there were a few old house foundations and a standing chimney in one of them. I don't know their exact age, but I would definitely say over half a century, maybe a lot more than that. Naturally, the chimney became one of our landmarks for when we wanted to go explore the woods. Anyway, myself and 3 other friends on this occasion, one of them being the guy who lived there obviously, decided it would be a cool idea to go drink out at the chimney. I think 2 of us were old enough to drink/buy alcohol, but myself and another friend weren't. We ended up with a few 6-packs, and we must have left to go out to the chimney at around midnight. We got to the chimney and started drinking, having fun, dinking around, etc. Drinking at that time seemed really glamorous and edgy to me because I was underage. A couple of hours went by. The foundation with the chimney sits about halfway up the valley, and off to one side, the path to get there goes steeply uphill and downhill. On the other side is a direct slope down into the middle of the valley, which was then full of bushes/small trees and tall grass but looked like it might have once been a pasture or something. There was a little stone wall that went roughly through the middle of the valley. Myself and my other underage friend were sitting at the edge of the foundation looking down into the valley, and, I believe, though I wasn't paying much attention to them at the time, our 2 older friends were in the middle of the foundation. I think they may have been tending a bonfire, but I don't remember for sure. At any rate, the 2 of us were sitting on a log looking out, which I remember clearly. At some point down in the valley, a very thick fog started to form. We both sat watching this for 10 to 15 minutes while chatting about random stuff and drinking. However, at one point I remember remarking to said friend that the fog was weird looking, it was extremely thick, almost smoke-like, and was now very quickly expanding/growing. Initially it had just been down at the bottom of the valley by the wall, but it was now starting to crawl up the valley towards us at a relatively slow pace. We both found this fascinating and sat and watched. After a minute or two, the fog was getting much closer, and I turned on my flashlight, we each had one, and shined it on the fog. This produced an unusual effect in that the beam of light did not highlight the fog the way that, say, the headlights of your car will give you a bit more vision but will also reflect off the fog back at you and also make it look brighter/more impenetrable. Instead, the light from the flashlight cut through the fog like butter, illuminating a perfectly flashlight beam-shaped hole in the fog all the way down into the valley to the wall. This seems really weird, and we both remarked on this and started to play with our flashlights. At some point the fog started to move uphill very quickly, and I think this is when I started to become aware that I felt very alarmed. The 2 of us who were sitting by the edge of the foundation were both starting to get freaked out at this point, and either he or I called our other friend's attention over to the fog. As we all watched it, it started to come uphill at a rate that I'm guessing was roughly jogging speed. I was standing up at this point, and I recall continuing to play around with the flashlight beam until I noticed that I could see vaguely defined people's shapes in the fog/mist/whatever. At about this point we all started yelling things like "What the hell is going on?" and "What the duck is wrong with that fog?" etc. Imagine a lot more foul language, which I don't feel is necessary to repeat here. We were at that age. More than anything, I remember becoming very afraid at that point and being aware that I wanted to run away. The 4 of us quickly agreed that we needed to leave, and after picking up our stuff, we all spontaneously took off at a run uphill towards the exit to the woods, which was maybe a mile or so out from the location of the chimney. As we were running away basically as fast as we could manage, I remember 3 things, though the entire run out of the woods probably took roughly 10 minutes. First, the fog, which had previously been localized to the bottom of the valley as far as we could tell, was suddenly everywhere. I don't remember a transition, but I remember suddenly realizing that we were completely surrounded by fog and that we were now running into it as much as away from it. Second, it got extremely dark. I believe we had all turned off our flashlights when leaving initially because it was light enough that night to see our way for the most part due to a large moon. Now, however, it was nearly pitch black. I'm guessing this was because we were now inside of the fog. I asked my friend in the lead, who happened to be the one who lived nearby, to turn his flashlight on, but he said he didn't want to because he didn't want to attract anything's attention. I recall this quite clearly, and told me to just run closely behind him because he had memorized the layout of the woods, which kind of pissed me off, but I was too overwhelmed with fear to protest. In fact, the fear itself was palpable, and I could see that the other 3 were also terrified. At roughly half of the way out from somewhere behind us, something started screaming. This is what I remember being the most frightening part of this experience, much more than the fog shapes or anything else. The scream didn't sound either human or animal to me. It was a single, long, sustained scream that didn't have the right sound to be human. I don't know how else to describe it, maybe the wrong pitch or something? At any rate, it was definitely a scream, long and sustained, not an animal call of any type. While we were still running, I asked one of my 3 friends who was alongside me, the other 21-plus guy who did not live near the woods, "Can you hear that?" He just kind of side-glanced at me and said, "If you ignore it, it doesn't exist." This always struck me as really weird, and I have never gotten a full explanation from him about this. In fact, every time I brought up this experience to him in later years, he was always very terse and acted like he wanted to move past it quickly. Anyway, that's the whole story. It's the closest thing to a supernatural encounter I've ever had, and also the only time I can ever think of feeling spine-tingling fear rather than just generic fear of physical harm or anything. My friends and I have been hiking and backpacking around the area many times, at least once a year on a good long multi-day backpacking trip, a few times in this same location, and other than car problems and sometimes friends not bringing the right gear, we've never had any issues. This specific trip was a 6-mile in, 6-mile out, 6K total elevation shift both ways trip to a lake. We did it in October, so we were preparing for extreme colds, potentially below freezing at night. There were only 3 of us, and we were all geared up for this. I was probably the least geared out of the trio, and I knew I'd be perfectly comfortable. So we begin the trek in. It took us until the end of the day, and we got to the lake no problem, set up camp, and just enjoyed ourselves to the sounds of nature, some MREs, and a couple pints of whiskey. At the end of the night, we all settled into our sleeping quarters, myself in a small tent, my friend in a hammock right next to me around the fire pit, and our other friend some distance away from us in a tent. Now it's important to note that my friend in the hammock was camped right next to me, maybe 10 feet away, while our other friend was probably 100 feet farther from me or so. I had trouble sleeping. Was restless, and even though I was warm, I kept getting shivers frequently and tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, which I just attributed to the cold. I didn't think anything of this at the time, and eventually I began to drift to sleep. The forest around was quiet, with the occasional sound of insects buzzing or a bird taking flight from a tree. That's when I was awoken by the sound of my friend's voice. Clear as day, I was groggy and a little confused as to why he was waking me up, but I clearly heard him say, "My name, help me." I immediately froze, as he sounded really desperate, and he said, "My name, help me," again. Then, before I got the chance to speak, I heard the voice again, "My name, help, I have to pee," and then he laughed in a way that sincerely only my friend does. It was a giggle that I'd known him to have since we had met many years ago. And so I responded, "Ha ha, duck off saying his name. I'm trying to sleep." And I thought that he was just trying to be funny. Thinking back on it, it would be very out of character for him to wake me up to pull some stupid joke like that, but I was half asleep and wrote it off. Although I knew something didn't feel quite right about it, I decided to just ignore him and let him do his business. He persisted. "Help, I need you. Come out here." I just mumbled about going back to sleep and to just go if he needed to. My memory is a little foggy as to how long we conversed back and forth and what exactly was said, but afterwards I noticed that he hadn't made any noise to leave to go pee or get back in his hammock as I was trying to fall back asleep, which I found odd but again, brushed off as nothing. Once the voice had been gone for a while and I assumed he had quietly gone on and gotten back to his hammock, I realized I had to pee badly and wasn't going to get any sleep until I did, so I got out of my tent and immediately walked over to his hammock to pull the same stunt he had on me, calling his name in a joking manner and waking him up to let him know I was there. But when he woke up, he was immediately thrown off by this. That's when I told him I was just going to pee like you had told me you were a bit ago. Maybe 15 minutes had passed, not enough time for someone to get back in their multi-layer cold weather hammock setup and fall deeply asleep again, not to mention he hadn't made a sound since our conversation stopped. He asked me what the hell I was talking about, and I asked him over and over if he was just outside my tent. He swore up and down he had been asleep since he laid down that night and never once got out of his hammock. That's when I felt the real chills go down my spine. Whatever had been outside my tent asking for help in this high-pitched mocking voice that my friend would sometimes joke with was not him. I told him, "Oh, okay, it was nothing then," and I proceeded to go pee, keeping eyes on my surroundings the whole time. Eventually, I was able to get back in my tent, warm up, and get drowsy enough to sleep, even though the events that had just transpired terrified me to my core. I am well aware of the lore of the areas around northern New Mexico, and I wouldn't be the first of my friends to go missing without a trace had I opened my tent and followed that voice that night. Somehow I shook it off and was tired enough to start drifting to sleep after I got cozied up. That's when it actually tried to get me. That half-awake state between sleeping and awake. You know, the place where you suddenly feel like you're falling but get jolted awake. Except this time I wasn't falling, something had grabbed onto my tent and was dragging it at what felt like 50 miles per hour across the forest floor. I felt every bump when the tent was hitting tree stumps and rocks, destroying my tent and trashing me around viciously as I was being pulled at an insane speed through the trees, seemingly in a straight line though, which didn't make sense in hindsight with how dense the trees are there. I yelled out and could feel my vocal cords moving, but very little sound came out. I must have traveled several hundred feet like this. That's when I opened my eyes. The only thing that felt different was that the tent was no longer moving. During this weird trance state of being dragged in my tent, everything looked identical. I was perfectly aware of my surroundings. It felt nothing like a dream. However, when I finally opened my eyes, I was lying in my tent, seemingly undisturbed and unharmed. I called out to my friend, feeling bad for waking him up but needing to know that this was reality, as the last place felt so real. He groggily woke up and said something back to me before going back to sleep. His response sounded legitimate to me. I thought, that actually sounds like him, realizing that whatever I had heard earlier was so far from anything he would actually do or say. That thing that called out to me in a high-pitched, whiny voice, mimicking my friend saying, "Help me. I need help, I have to pee. Come out here." It still haunts me to this day. After asking him about it the next morning, he just laughed and swore to me that he absolutely did not get up in the middle of the night and say anything to me, much less try to joke with me about getting out of my tent to help him. Whatever that was, specifically targeted me. My friends have been back there since I opted out of that trip. Skinwalker Ranch. Skinwalker Ranch is hands down one of the most mysterious places on Earth, crossing over into nearly every category of the paranormal world. Where else could UFO sightings be linked with poltergeist-like activity, interdimensional portals, shape-shifting humans, and mutant wolf encounters? We've been obsessed with this case for years, ever since discovering it through a Paracast episode. Ever since then, we've been feverishly accumulating as much material as we can to try and understand what the hell is going on at what seems like a military installation devoted to experimenting on paranormal entities. The indefatigable paranormal author Joni Mayan took on the task of delving into this inscrutable and profoundly disturbing mystery. It's a subject deserving of the space we are now about to devote to it, and we believe strongly that you will be shocked and petrified when you start fully absorbing the nuances of this multi-generational enigma that can rightly be called the greatest sustained paranormal mystery of all time. Located in the Erie, Utah basin of northeastern Utah and surrounded on three sides by mountains and cliffs, Skinwalker Ranch has been the source of thousands of UFO-type sightings and strange encounters reported by intrepid journalists who have dared to trespass on this private property. The general consensus is that some kind of above top secret paranormal experimentation has been taking place there, but to truly understand how creepy and mysterious Skinwalker Ranch is, you have to know the history and the context. Some people have attributed the phenomenon to the original Navajo legend of the Skinwalker. 1. The Navajo origins of the Skinwalker. By definition, a Skinwalker is a person, usually of Native American origin, who has the ability to transform into an animal of their choice. In the Navajo culture, Skinwalkers can assume different forms based on their needs. If they want to fly, they can be a bird, then transform into a wolf when they reach their destination. Due to their inhuman bursts of speed, they are nearly impossible to catch and can only be killed if they are mortally injured in the neck region. Skinwalkers are often lurkers, standing outside windows or approaching people on lonely highways. They can read minds to know what scares people and then use that information to instill fear and control their victims. 2. Skinwalkers in the Utah Basin. The legend of the Skinwalker in the Utah Basin area reportedly started in the 1800s, when European colonists began moving further west, pushing out the Native American tribes who had resided there for more than 1,000 years. During the Civil War, some Ute members allegedly took orders from Kit Carson in the battle against the Navajo, resulting in a curse on the land. Some believe a Skinwalker was created in the process and that it still lives in the heart of the basin in a place called Shadow Canyon. Local tribe members avoid the area at all costs for fear of angering it. 3. An interdimensional doorway. Shaman healer Michael Robishaw feels there's even more to the Uinta Basin area than the legends suggest. He believes the area might be an interdimensional doorway to another realm. I think it's a portal but also has the spiritual basis of Native American rituals of an ancient origin that may be so old that even tribal elders don't even have the whole story of such an active place. It may be where the past meets the future, he said. 4. Paranormal activity at the Skinwalker Ranch. What started out as a local legend would quickly gain national exposure, opening up a sea of interest and speculation. It would soon become perhaps the most thoroughly researched paranormal hotspot in the world, while providing its fair share of controversies and conspiracy theories in the process. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman started the ball rolling when they purchased a 480-acre ranch in the Basin area. It was a beautiful parcel of land with a picturesque ridge in the background, framing the rugged terrain, a meandering stream, and a fringe of boxwood trees on the property. They hoped to realize their dreams of starting a cattle ranch, breeding top-quality animals, while raising their 2 children in the scenic surroundings. Initially, the Shermans were curious about why such a beautiful ranch had sat unoccupied for 7 years. They got their answer shortly after moving in. The oddities began piling up, one by one. They found heavy iron stakes with metal chains at each end of the house, as though someone had chained up large animals to guard the doors. Padlocks were bolted onto many of the doors, inside and out, suggesting that previous occupants were concerned for their safety. None of it made any sense to the new ranch owners, but they shrugged it off without giving it much thought. That would change soon enough. 5. An enormous, indestructible wolf. The day they moved their belongings into the small ranch cabin, they received their first dose of reality. A large wolf approached them as they stood outside with Terry's father, Ed. It was larger than any wolf the couple had ever seen, possibly weighing as much as 200 pounds. Both Terry and his father were over 6 feet tall, and the wolf was easily chest high on both of them. Nothing about the wolf suggested hostility. It acted like a lost pet, eager for attention. While they were initially leery of the animal, primarily due to its size, their concerns fell away quickly as the massive animal began brushing up against the 2 men, smelling strongly like a wet dog. Gwen stood off to the side, keeping a close eye on her 2 children, who were standing on a flatbed trailer, watching the scene unfold. After she grew more comfortable with the situation, she called the kids over to the animal, who showered it with attention and begged to keep it as a pet, but Terry knew from experience that wolves were cunning predators, and he just unloaded several prized Angus calves into a nearby pen. After a few moments, the wolf darted over to the pen and brazenly grabbed a calf by the head and attempted to pull it through the bars of the corral. Sherman and his father attempted to save the cow by kicking it in the ribs and then beating it with a stick of wood, but the wolf wasn't deterred. "Get my magnum," Terry called to his son, Tad. As soon as Terry got his gun, he shot the wolf twice at point-blank range. Both bullets hit their mark, which should have killed the enormous beast, but it was unfazed by the assault. It continued trying to pull the distressed calf from the pen, showing no signs of injury. Terry shot the wolf a 3rd time, which finally seemed to get the animal's attention. It released its hold on the calf and backed off a few feet, but still didn't run away, which would have been normal wolf behavior. Terry took aim and shot the animal a 4th time, striking it in the heart with what should have been a fatal blow, but the wolf still wasn't harmed. The sense of panic was nearly palpable. Why wouldn't it die? Not knowing what else to do, Terry's father retrieved a shotgun from his truck and shot the wolf again. This time, the results were visible. A flurry of fur and flesh flew into the air, the bullet undeniably hitting its mark. Instead of falling to the ground dead, the wolf backed off several more feet and continued to regard them with its icy blue stare. What was it going to take to bring down this beast? Ed took aim again and shot the beast in the chest, sending more fur and flesh flying. The wolf stared at them for a moment before calmly loping away. When they attempted to pursue it, they were mystified to discover that the track suddenly ended. It was as though the wolf vanished into thin air. The wolf's sighting was only a prelude to what would happen next. The family began noticing other odd occurrences around the ranch, including strange balls of light that seemed to hover in the sky. 6. Strange voices, faces at the window, apparitions, objects disappearing. Along with the orbs, they also saw peculiar lights in the sky and voices that seemed to come from directly above their heads. They started seeing faces at the windows, which turned into apparitions standing at the foot of their beds. Members of the family began having terrifying nightmares, and objects began disappearing, only to reappear somewhere else. One day, Gwen carried in groceries from the car and unloaded them onto the counter, preparing to put them away. She turned around, distracted by something. When she turned back, all the groceries were back in the bags, as though she'd never unpacked them. The strangeness only increased from there. 7. Cattle mutilations. They began smelling a strong musky scent that couldn't be explained. They also began finding their prized cattle dead in the fields, mutilated beyond belief. Some had their genital areas mutilated, while another had its eye completely removed, as if done surgically. Cattle began disappearing at an alarming rate, which was detrimental to Terry's ranching business. He lost 20% of his herd in 2 years, which is excessive compared to the normal 1% rate that most ranchers in the area face. The orbs of light seemed particularly intrigued by the cattle, often lingering over their heads. Terry wasn't certain what to do about his losses. His cattle weren't ordinary cows. They were prized cattle that cost him thousands of dollars. Having them disappear so mysteriously was disconcerting, to say the least, especially considering many of them vanished without a trace, leaving a trail of hoof imprints behind them. Things would only get worse. 8. More strange animals and lights. Lights would appear out of the sky, blanketing the entire area to near dark conditions. Strange animals were often seen roaming around the ranch. Bright tropical birds were spotted in the trees, and their dogs became so fearful of the activity, they cowered in their dog houses and refused to come out, even for food and water. 6 of their outdoor cats disappeared in a single night. The final straw came one night when their dogs began chasing one of the strange orbs of light. Harry Sherman encouraged the dogs to chase it, and they quickly disappeared into the darkness. Moments later, he heard the undeniable sounds of the animals yelping. They pursued the sound but could find no trace of the animals. The next morning, they discovered 3 scorched circles in the ground with gooey lumps of liquefied flesh in the centers. Something had killed the dogs. Enough was enough. Life on the ranch wasn't what they imagined. The financial losses from the missing cattle were nearly bankrupting them. The children's grades were dropping, and sleeping was becoming a real issue for the family due to the constant activity and nightmares. Towards the end, they were all sleeping together in the same room, hoping for safety in numbers. After telling their story to a journalist at a Salt Lake City newspaper, the Shermans were approached by an unusual buyer. 9. Skinwalker Ranch changes ownership. Turns into paranormal research facility. In 1996, hotel entrepreneur Bigelow paid the Shermans $200,000 for their ranch and turned it into a research facility to study the paranormal events, founding NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, to formalize the project. Over a period of time, he hired psychologists, engineers, physicists, and biologists to aid in his research, and he locked down the ranch, hiring former military security guards to keep it protected from outsiders. He established a science advisory board and brought in state-of-the-art equipment. The tables were turning at Skinwalker Ranch. The hunters were now being hunted. During the early days at the ranch, the NIDS team consisted of a veterinarian, a physicist, and a biochemist. Even though the Shermans moved to a ranch 25 miles away, Terry Sherman agreed to stay on as the ranch manager, caring for the livestock both he and NIDS brought in to act as bait for the paranormal activity. Teams investigated the ranch in pairs, often bringing a dog along with them as they made their rounds. One of the researchers hired for the ranch was PhD Colum A. Kelleher, a biochemist with 15 years of cell and molecular biology experience. Kelleher became the deputy administrator of NIDS and, among other things, documented the events that transpired at the ranch. The team's veterinarian inspected the cattle, finding no outward cause of death. The bodies were too far along in their decomposition for any further analysis to be done, so they tucked the information away, hoping it would make more sense later. George Knapp, a respected journalist who was known for his work on another UFO story that brought him both fame and disdain from his fellow journalists, joined the team. Never before had so many resources been provided for the sake of paranormal research. He was anxious to see what they would uncover. Soon after arriving on the ranch, Knapp had his first experience with the glowing orb lights. 2 groups were stationed in different areas of the ranch to watch for activity. As Knapp's group waited for something to happen, they saw a bright yellow orb of light shoot out from behind the ridge. It moved silently but swiftly, at the speed of a jet airplane. To their amazement, it circled in a perfect 360 loop before shooting back across the ridge. The event happened so unexpectedly that the only photos they were able to capture didn't properly document it. They would have to settle for the personal experience. 10. Intelligent but maniacal on-site predator. It wasn't until January of 1997 that activity at the Skinwalker Ranch began to majorly escalate. Harry Sherman called with news of more activity. This time, instead of mysterious orbs, more cows had been mutilated. In the midst of an intense snowstorm, with temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees, 3 calves were found with odd wounds on their ears and eyes. 2 of the calves had circular spots cut out of their eyelids, while the third calf's ears had been shredded, as if cut with scissors. The veterinarian called to inspect them and found the injuries to be strange, especially considering they occurred during the midst of a major snowstorm. Typically, natural predators, such as coyotes and wolves, don't hunt in such dire weather conditions. After another calf's mutilation occurred in broad daylight a month later, the researchers were more perplexed than ever. What was going on at Skinwalker Ranch? The NIDS team flew in from Nevada after receiving Sherman's second call and were shocked at what they saw. The 85-pound dead calf was spayed out, nearly spread eagle. One of its legs had been yanked from the knee socket with brute force and was placed away from the body as though it were staged. All the calf's internal organs were missing, and the body was entirely drained of blood. There wasn't so much as a drop of blood on or around the body. This definitely wasn't the work of a natural predator. As they stood at the scene, scratching their heads in wonder, they noticed the mother cow standing nearby. She had her head down and was in a state of agitation, having witnessed something the researchers could only guess about. The team veterinarian inspected the calf, coming upon a strange discovery. One of the calf's ears was missing. It had been cut neatly down to the skull, not torn off. If a predator had done this, the flesh would have been ragged and ripped, but this one was removed with surgical precision. Even stranger, the ear that was removed had sported a large yellow tag, used to identify the cow. They searched the entire ranch, looking for the tag, but never found it. It was almost as though the unseen predator was taking souvenirs, like some maniacal serial killer. Even the ranch dogs seemed shaken by the series of events. Instead of greeting the men with wagging tails, they cowered in their pens, obviously traumatized. It took them 2 days to come out of their pens, but even then they were still visibly uneasy. Something was undeniably still lurking in the area. 11. Giant bird of prey? Later that night, the researchers were alerted by the sound of the dogs barking and howling. They looked around the immediate vicinity but couldn't see what was causing the ruckus. They jumped into the farm truck and began scouring the area, using the truck spotlight to inspect the outlying areas. Nothing seemed amiss until they came to a clump of trees. One of the cows was hunkered beneath the trees, separated from the rest of the herd, a typical sign that the animal was in distress. When the men got out of the truck to check on her, their lights caught the glow of amber eyes in the tree above her. Thinking it was a large cat, they shot the beast with a high-powered rifle. The second the shot rang out, the amber eyes disappeared, but when they searched the area, they could find no trace of the beast. It was as though it disappeared before their eyes. The team searched the area, looking for tracks in the snow, but didn't find anything. Surely if something ran away, it would have left tracks behind. As they continued to hunt for the predator, they came upon a startling sight. Instead of a cat footprint, they found what appeared to be the print of a giant bird of prey. It was nearly 6 inches in diameter, with 2 sharp claw marks protruding from the rear. Alarmed, they searched the area further and found another single print 20 feet away. By the depth of the print, they judged the animal to be large and heavy, unlike anything they'd ever seen on the ranch. The following month, more strange events unfolded that would force them to question their own sanity. 12. Magnetic anomalies that defy explanation. 4 of Terry's prized bulls disappeared from their pen. The disappearance was strange on several levels. Anyone who understands bull behavior knows that bulls aren't easily maneuvered like prized ponies. Moving them from one area to another typically requires time and planning. Having them disappear in the blink of an eye in broad daylight was incomprehensible. They looked everywhere but couldn't find them. As a last resort, Terry checked the small cattle trailer that was near the fence and was shocked to find the 4 bulls tightly loaded inside. Even more concerning was the fact that the trailer was still locked with wire wrapped tightly around the clasp. Thick cobwebs bracketed the edges of the doorway as well. Whatever had moved the cattle into the trailer had done so without using the door. When they opened the doors, the bulls seemingly woke up from a trance state and assumed a high level of agitation, bashing against the sides of the trailer and each other in their attempts to get out. Terry wasn't sure what to make of it. Loading one of the bulls into the trailer would have been difficult, but loading all 4 in was impossible, especially considering the size of the space. Keeping them there quietly until someone happened upon them went beyond the realm of belief. Once they unloaded the bulls, they inspected the corral with their equipment. To their amazement, they discovered that the bars of the corral were highly magnetized. The readings were especially high near the area where the trailer butted against the fence. What would cause the bars to become magnetized? They couldn't understand it. They continued to check the levels, watching them drop steadily for 48 hours until they reached a 0 reading. The magnetic mystery continued for several more days as they randomly picked up strong readings around the ranch. Interestingly enough, the high levels of magnetism seemed to be affecting the animals on the ranch as well. When the researchers saw a high reading, the cows and dogs were often reacting as though they were seeing something the humans couldn't detect. Using this information, they decided to watch the dogs more carefully. They constructed several pens around the property and built platforms where they could observe the activity. Almost immediately, strange things began happening to the pens themselves. Padlocks would disappear and gates would open of their own accord, with no explanation regarding how it happened. 13. UFOs and entities at Skinwalker Ranch. What is really going on? Retired school teacher and local UFO expert, Joe Jr. Hicks, has documented over 400 UFO sightings in the area after witnessing a craft pass over the school where he taught. The UFO activity really started getting intense in the early 1950s, he said. There were cases where the whole school and all the teachers saw these things hovering over the town in broad daylight. In the 60s and 70s, we probably had more UFO sightings than any place in the world, Hicks said in an article published by George Knapp in the Las Vegas Mercury. The strange orbs of light have continued to plague the ranch as well. The lights appear out of nowhere, radiating with an intense glow and possessing a sort of responsive intelligence no one can pinpoint. At times, the lights appear to chase the cattle and even threaten the human occupants of the ranch if they attempt to come close. The activity doesn't fit any of the known patterns of UFO sightings. Typically, the UFOs appear high in the sky, shying away from human contact, but these orbs are afraid of nothing. Like the other phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch, capturing them on film has proven difficult to impossible. Every time the NIDS team attempted to film them, the photos would come out blurry and unremarkable. By August of 1997, the light anomaly phenomenon became even stranger, with several orbs appearing at the same time, zipping around the fields. Even though they set up cameras on poles around the ranch, they weren't able to catch much of the activity on film. Whatever was plaguing the ranch refused to be recorded. 14. A large black faceless humanoid appears from a portal. One night, while the NIDS team was observing the ranch from atop a bluff, they noticed a faint yellow light appear 150 feet away from them. One of the researchers grabbed a pair of binoculars, watching in stunned silence as the yellow light grew larger and transformed into a tunnel. "Something's in the tunnel," the man with the binoculars said, clearly in a panic. As he watched, a large black faceless humanoid form lumbered out of the tunnel and walked away. The yellow light then slowly faded until it was completely gone. As the researchers tried to make sense of what they'd just witnessed, they came to the horrific realization that whatever had climbed out of the tunnel was now sharing the darkness with them. They spent the rest of the night and most of the next day searching for footprints or signs of the creature's presence, but came up empty-handed once again. 15. Extraterrestrials or some kind of responsive consciousness. The activity continued well into 1999. They still saw the strange orb lights but still couldn't fully capture them on camera. The researchers began finding the cameras dismantled or missing altogether. The entities were not only elusive but were also knowledgeable about technology as well. According to one NIDS researcher, it isn't as simple as saying that ETs or flying saucers are doing it. It's some kind of consciousness, but it's always something new and different, something non-repeatable. It's reactive to people and equipment, and we set up the ranch to be a proving ground for the scientific method, but science doesn't seem amenable to the solution of these kinds of problems. 16. Strange beast-like creatures appear. Terry and Gwen were leaving the ranch one day to head back to their new ranch when they saw something dart across the field, where they kept several horses. Thinking it was a dog attacking one of the horses, Terry stopped the truck and jumped out, only to realize the strange beast wasn't a dog at all. It was unlike anything the rancher had ever seen. It looked like a brownish-red hyena with a large bushy tail. As the creature saw him coming, it retreated up a slope and disappeared into thin air, leaving no tracks behind. When Terry came back to check on the horses, he was horrified to see that both horses had bloody claw marks on their hocks. While it was proof the horses were attacked, it wasn't the proof the NIDS team was looking for. So far, nearly everything they'd witnessed couldn't be documented. 17. Element 115. One NIDS scientist has claimed to have discovered rods made from element 115, which does not originate on Earth. This man goes on to claim that he had worked at Area 51 on a reverse engineering project where they had accumulated 300 pounds of this material. 18. More creepy eyewitness encounters at Skinwalker Ranch. In August 1977, Jay Barker and a group of friends and family hiked the high Uinta Mountains, hoping to catch fish in the Cooper Basin. After having dismal results, he suggested they climb the ridge and go down to Fish Lake, a place he'd had success fishing before. As they climbed the ridge, he looked down and saw something that was black and white. Initially, he thought it was an elk, but as he watched it stand upright, he realized he was looking at a bipedal creature. It had a black body but had white hair on the back of its neck. As it walked around the pond, they could see it swinging its arms and walking upright on two legs. It was just enormous, a huge creature with lots of weight to it and mass, he says on the YouTube video of his experience. They observed the creature for approximately 3 minutes as it made its way around the pond. Another Bigfoot sighting was reported in 2014 near Sundance, Utah, which is 53 miles south of Salt Lake City. As a couple was driving in the Provo Canyon, they saw something in the trees and began filming as they were driving, not realizing they had captured something on their camera until they got home. One of the UFO enthusiasts drawn to the area was Ryan Skinner. A native of Wisconsin, Ryan began investigating the ranch in 2007 after having a terrifying encounter in the Uinta Basin. In his book Skinwalker Ranch, Path of the Skinwalker, he documented his forays into the basin. In December of 2006, Ryan and his fiancée, Ernia, took a trip from Wisconsin to Las Vegas, where they planned to get married. During a long drive down a deserted road in Utah, he turned the wheel over to Ernia so he could rest his eyes for a while. He was brought out of a light slumber by the sound of his fiancée screaming. "What is that?" she shrieked. Ryan jolted upright, immediately noticing a red light reflecting off the Jeep's rear view mirror. At first, he thought it was just a reflection from a streetlight, but as he looked closer, he realized the light was coming from a red glowing object looming overhead. It almost looked like a red sparkler suspended high in the air. As he stared in awe, he could make out the long rectangular shape of a craft in the glow. Ernia pulled the vehicle over to the side of the road, and Ryan jumped out for a closer look. To his amazement, the glowing ball of light hovered 5 feet off the ground, only 30 feet from their Jeep. He stared into the light, mesmerized by the sight. He was drawn out of his near-hypnotic gaze by the sound of Ernia screaming his name. Going back about a couple of decades or so, I was living in London and would make a hiking or camping trip every 6 or 8 weeks as a way to deal with living in the middle of the city. One time a friend asked to come along, so he and I went to the New Forest in the southwest of England. The New Forest isn't actually new at all, the same way New College of Oxford University is anything but new. It has some of the few areas of ancient forest left in the UK. We're walking around on all these well-managed pathways, and when it got to mid-afternoon, we thought, let's head off the tracks, get into the actual woodland, and then find a spot to camp. I take a compass bearing, and we turn off the path and head directly into the woods, making our way through the trees and ferns for around a mile, maybe. I had the most curious sensation go through me, stopped and turned to my buddy, and said, "Listen." The forest had suddenly gone completely silent, no birdsong, no sound at all, not even the leaves rustling in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, my hand on my buddy's shoulder, trying to figure out what was occurring. I eventually shrugged and decided whatever it was would just have to be. The sensation that went there for me wasn't threatening, but more curious, a feeling of curiosity. About 200 or 300 yards further, we found an ideal spot for camp, a large clearing, broadly circular in shape, plenty of space to set up camp, and also a small fire. It was spring in the UK, so safe to do. We put our tents together, then I dig a fire pit while my pal starts gathering wood. There are even some logs we can use for seats, too, and pretty soon we have a really comfortable setup. Night draws in, the fire's going nicely, we get dinner down us, and out comes a bottle of Black Label. We're drinking and sharing stories and have completely forgotten anything about that curious feeling from earlier. Time goes on, and we're getting tired, so call it a night. We stomp out the fire, pee on it, and pour plenty of water on it, then throw a load of soil on it and kick it around to make sure it's out, then say goodnight, and we both go into our tents and get our heads down. It usually takes me a while to get to sleep the first couple of days camping, and maybe it was the whiskey, but I was out like a light the instant my head was down. The first time I woke up, I could hear yelling, a man's voice from far away, miles beyond the direction of my buddy's tent. I couldn't make out any words, the voice coming from far away, but I could tell from the tone that it wasn't distress. I don't know why I'd dismiss it as interesting but nothing to worry about, but that's what I did, and I went right back to sleep. The second time I woke up, I could see a ball of bright white light shining through the material of my tent. It was slightly larger than a tennis ball, and in my estimation, about 20 yards away, on the opposite side of the clearing, and it traveled in a perfect line, in a perfectly flat, linear direction, from left to right. It wasn't bobbing up and down like a torch being carried, it moved in a flat line, gliding. Again, that curious feeling went through me, and as I knew it was there, I sensed that it knew I was there. I reached for the zip of my tent to open it and look inside when a voice in my head said, "Don't look." It was the same experience as when you're a child and an adult warns you, don't touch something dangerous, not angry or scary, but a very clear warning to not do something. My hand frozen, fingers on the zipper, and I'm looking at the ball of light shining through the tent lining, that feeling of curiosity in me. "Go back to sleep," said the voice in my head. Again, not scary but very much an instruction. I immediately put my head back down and sleep literally pulled me in. It wasn't me falling asleep, so much as sleep reaching for me and pulling me in. When I open my eyes, it's daylight, so I open the zipper of my tent, and the campsite is as it was when we left it. Nothing changed, nothing moved. I felt like I'd had the best night's sleep ever. I still do after all these years, absolutely fresh, bright, alert, fully rested, and energized. The zip on my buddy's tent opens, and his head sticks out, a big grin on his face. "Morning," he calls out. "Good morning," I reply. "How are you feeling?" "Great," he says, a big smile on his face. "Brilliant, in fact. I had an awesome night's sleep." "Me too, man," I said. "We went through a bottle of whiskey last night, and I don't feel hungover in the slightest." "Same here." He says it with a big smile. "I feel perfectly fine. I believe we managed to get away with it." We clamber out of our tents and get some water boiling to start a morning brew going, have some breakfast, and as we're breaking down camp, I ask him, "Did you see or hear anything weird during the night?" "Nope, I slept right through, out the moment my head hit the pillow." "Really? There was something weird going on last night, mate," I tell him. "I could hear someone yelling out in the woods." "Wait, now you mention it." My buddy looked at me. "Yeah, I did hear someone shouting something. It was coming from that direction." He waved in the direction behind my tent. "I heard it coming from that direction," I said and pointed beyond his tent. "Could you make out any words?" He shook his head and carried on taking down his tent. I thought to ask if he'd seen anything during the night but decided not to. Seeing bright lights floating in the woods at night and hearing voices in your head isn't exactly sane sounding, so I let it go. We set off, and basically that was that. We grabbed lunch at a pub, then back to the car and drove back to London. I'm in my 50s now, and I've never experienced anything like that before or since, and it's still probably the best night's rest I've ever had. I want to share the story of what happened to me last night. I'll preface this story by saying I'm an avid outdoorsman and spend lots of time camping, backpacking, and mountaineering. I have never been as spooked in the woods as I was last night. I'm not a storyteller, so bear with me. The story begins with me camping in southern Oregon, which is a very rugged and rural area. I'm camping here with a group of friends who all have trailers or RVs, but I think it takes the novelty out of camping, so I've always just used my tent. We go out camping a few times a year in different parts of Oregon or Northern California and have a really great time. This particular campground was pretty remote and barren, with just my group and the camp host there for the weekend. Well, last night was different than anything I'd experienced. We were all drinking around the campfire till about midnight when we said goodnight and retired to our sites. I absolutely shot awake around 2:45 to 3, with a horrible feeling in my stomach, which I couldn't explain. But any person knows to trust that feeling. I couldn't explain why I was wide awake until, after a few minutes, I began to hear noises coming from the tree line behind my tent, about 20 to 30 feet away, of what sounded like a big creature. Big cat, deer, or human. The thing that made these noises really effing weird was they only happened about every 10 seconds, and they were clearly the sound of something large moving at the edge of the tree line around the tent. My mind immediately thought human. I say edge because I couldn't pinpoint how deep in the trees it was, but it was close and clearly audible. I decided to get out of my tent and look around, but I forgot my flashlight at my buddy's site, so I got up with my trusty knife and looked in the darkness to see if I could spot anything. When I got up, I immediately noticed that there was a car that had pulled into the vacant spot next to me, but absolutely not in the spot where a car would normally be. It was about halfway deep in the campsite, 10 feet away, facing directly at my tent, which makes it parallel to the road. I'm pretty sure there was no one in the car, but it was dark. This was where I really started to alert. Not only did I notice the car, but the moment I stood up, the noises completely stopped, like whatever was out there saw me stand up and wanted to avoid detection. At this point, I was fully freaked out. I continued to just stand and listen, honestly quite frozen from adrenaline. After a few minutes of standing up outside, I saw what I think was a camera flash, facing right towards me from about 40 feet away, 20 or so feet deep in the tree line, but I noticed it was clear as day. It was at this point that I freaked out and ran across the street to my buddy's site. I couldn't tell if something chased me, but it sure felt like it. I threw open the door to my buddy's camper and scared the shit out of him and his wife. I explained a few details to them and asked if I could crash on their couch. They agreed and went back to sleep pissed off. This trailer was parallel with the road, and right above the couch was a big window that looked perfectly out on my tent and the car, so I sat on that couch and watched the tree line for a long time. With about a half hour of seeing and hearing nothing, I decided I should probably go to sleep, and maybe I was just freaking out for no reason. I was safe in the trailer and decided to let it go. I went to lay down and finally stopped staring out of the window, and literally immediately as I laid down, I heard someone sprinting across the street, around the area of my tent. I shot up and saw a figure rip open the door to the car and quickly speed off in that same car that was parked right in front of my tent. It was almost as if they could see me watching and knew when to stop. Now I really don't know what I experienced. My friends all have just been giving me shit about it, saying it was just some normal guy, and I was probably just drunk and hallucinating. However, I trusted my gut feeling and feel I may have avoided a really scary situation. I had my bike and paddleboard not secured, as well as my Blackstone. Nothing was stolen, including my wallet, which was right outside my tent on the ground. To me, that makes it even weirder. I've looked into wanted lists today or still on the loose serial killers and couldn't find anything. If you all are able to find out anything about serial killers or people who might be looking for violent crime in the area, let me know. One night, like many others, I was out camping with my girlfriend before we had our first child. We'd go out and drink, smoke, cook, and just relax in the deep woods. This night there was no smoke, however, just alcohol. We started talking about trees and whether or not it's possible they have conscious energy attached to them. That turned into us talking about the experiments showing that plants communicate with chemicals via the root system and alike. Then it proceeded to go on to slightly crazier things, like, everything appears separate but is really just the same thing emanating reality. Suddenly I noticed this old man kind of hiding behind a tree looking at me. Once I locked eyes with him, he walked up very slowly. I thought maybe we had gone too far and accidentally trespassed, so I started apologizing. "Hey, I'm sorry, we were told we're allowed to camp back here," and he replies, "It's okay, that's not why I'm here." He was carrying some sort of black staff looking thing. Not sure how to word it. If anyone here has ever used a landscaping rake, then you know how it has fat teeth. This staff was black, as mentioned, about 4 feet long and almost T-shaped, except one half of the top of the T was shorter than the other. The top of the T had a bunch of little things coming out of it that reminded me of a landscaping rake. That's really a horrible thing to compare it to, but of anything I can think of, it's the best. I noticed something very odd while he was there. It seemed very bright. I noticed that while he was there, none of the torches were flickering. They were stuck in place / the flame wasn't moving. My girlfriend wasn't moving. The old man walked up to a stream beside me and was staring into it as he spoke. The water wasn't moving. He went on to tell me, "It's all true. There were words said before that, but it's been over 2 years. The prior words were essentially that he was talking about the massive energy / etc. One thing he said seemed rather important but also quite confusing, which is what to me made this experience stupid. It was, 'You have to help her,' he said that right at the very end of the conversation before he disappeared. Most of the rest of the conversation was about me taking time to meditate more, experiment ube more, etc. to help her. At first I thought maybe he meant my girl. I also wondered if he meant the energy that our visible universe is emanating from. Like, things aren't right, and she / everything needs a little help / tweaking to get back on track. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but he was gone just like that. I turned to my girlfriend and asked, "Where did the old guy go?" She says, "What old guy?" Me, the one I was just talking to for 5 minutes. Her, "Babe, you just stopped in the middle of a sentence and asked where the old guy went." From her perspective, she never saw the old man. I was in the middle of answering a question when I first saw him. Apparently everything that happened involving him, she did not experience. So, I thought maybe I'd finally lost it or somehow my beer was tainted. I sat there in disbelief, but we continued our night as normal. When I woke up, I was really bothered by the event because it seemed so real. So I took a walk from our fire pit to where I saw the man first. Mind you, we're surrounded by a bunch of weeds except for where it's cleared for the fire and tent. There were footprints in the weeds leading from where I first saw him by the tree up to our campfire. A few feet back, there was a perfect circle about 3 feet wide. It was laid down like a crop circle. From the circle were the footprints of the old man. There were no other prints leading to it and no way it was just some hoax. Time stood still, and the old man was very real. I don't share this much because it makes me feel like I sound crazy, but I would never lie about something like this. It's boggled my mind for years now. I had to get clean to an extent, bad stuff, and get my life stable, but now that it is, I intend on following his directions. At least the ones that weren't Kung Fu Master vague. Maybe an alien, maybe an energy or hyperdimensional being, I'm not sure, but it was definitely real. Many things I've seen have been backed up or observed by others. I wish my girlfriend would have been able to see or I'd taken pictures.